In this video, we'll be going over 10 cards which have had such a drastic effect on the game that it either changed how players play the game or had the game change around them. And at number 10, we have Infinite Impermanence. This is a card that has both a hand and on-field effect, where if you have an empty field, you can use it from your hand to negate the effects of a monster. And if it's on the field and activated like a normal trap card, it also has the same effect to negate the effect of a monster, but gains an additional effect, where for the rest of the turn it negates the effects of all spell and trap cards in the same column as it. So with Infinite Impermanence, the way this card changed the game was not in its hand effect, because it's basically just another version of Effect Veiler. And actually, it's its on-field effect, which makes it so you're incentivized to not play spell and traps in the same column as your opponent's face-down spell and trap cards, because you never know if they're going to have an Infinite Impermanence in that zone and be able to negate your effect. To a lesser extent, the Mech Knights also incentivize you to not play spell and traps in the same column as your opponent's spell and traps, but Infinite Impermanence is one of the most played hand traps in the game, and definitely is more influential in making people not play spell and traps in the same column as their opponents. Even if your opponent doesn't have Infinite Impermanence, people will still avoid playing cards in the same column as your opponent's face-down cards, just because Infinite Impermanence exists. These are the kinds of cards we'll be talking about on this list. Cards that have such an impact that they influence how you play the game, even if they don't actually exist in your opponent's deck. And at number 9, we have Nibiru the Primal Being. This is another pretty new card, even newer than Infinite Impermanence as it only came out in 2019, and has the effect where, if your opponent summons 5 or more monsters during the main phase, you can then activate this card from your hand to tribute all monsters on the field, give your opponent a super token that has all the stats of the tributed monsters, and then you get to special summon Nibiru from your hand. Being able to tribute all the monsters in the field can kind of win you the game by itself in most cases, and it's an incredibly powerful hand trap effect. So the way this card changes the game is that if you're trying to get out a whole bunch of monsters, chances are you're going to count how many summons you're doing during that turn, and then think twice before performing your 5th summon. If you don't have a way to negate Nibiru by the time you have your 5th summon, and you don't know what cards in your opponent's hand, there is a chance you might just stop there, even if your opponent doesn't have a Nibiru, just in case they do. It also incentivizes people to try to get out a negate as early as possible in their combos if they want to extend past 5 summons, even if it would make their combos less efficient. Nibiru is another excellent example of a card which completely warps the game around itself, and really helps to slow down the potential of combo decks, and kind of completely counters archetypes that don't have a way to answer Nibiru natively. Just like Infinite Impermanence, there's a good chance your opponent will play around Nibiru, even if you don't actually have the card in your hand. And at number 8, we have number 101, Silent Honor Arc. This is a rank 4 Xyz monster, which simply has the effect, where it can detach 2 of its materials to absorb one of your opponent's face-up attack position special summoned monsters. In which case it becomes one of this card's new materials, and this card has another effect, where if it would be destroyed you can detach one of its materials instead. Since Honor Arc had generic level 4 materials, it was one of the first non-destruction removal extract monsters that players got access to when it came out, and that made it an absolute powerhouse for removing destruction immune cards, like Stardust Dragon for example. And what was so influential about Silent Honor Arc was that it was such a good removal boss monster that it kind of incentivized people to summon their cards in defense position. Because Honor Arc only worked on face-up attack position cards, so if you simply summon that monster into defense position, then it couldn't be absorbed with Honor Arc. So even if your opponent didn't have Silent Honor Arc in their extra deck, during this card's heyday, most players would summon their boss monster in defense position that they didn't want their opponent to steal anyway. Nowadays, people still kinda do this, but because of Lightning Storm and not Honor Arc. Lightning Storm can destroy all of your opponent's face-up attack position monsters, and it's a great going second card. So it reintroduced the popularity of summoning your big boss monster defense position if it wasn't destruction immune. Even if no one really uses number 101 Silent Honor Arc anymore, it was the first card that popularized summoning a monster in defense position. And at number 7, we have Evenly Matched. This is a trap card which can only be activated at the end of the battle phase if your opponent controls more cards than you do, where you then make your opponent banish a number of cards they control so that they control the same number of cards as you do. Oh, and also, if you don't control any cards, you can activate this card from your hand. Now, Evenly Matched is such a powerful card that it almost single-handedly popularized the going second deck. Before Evenly Matched, going first was always the better choice. It was so good that Konami had to limit how powerful going first was, through changing the rules of the game where you can no longer draw a card during your first turn. Even with that change, it was still incredibly powerful, and going second was just a detriment, as win percentage is heavily favored whoever went first. Evenly Matched was a start of cards that are so good if you're able to go second with them, that there are legitimate versions of the same decks that either want to go first or go second. If your opponent set up a full board of monsters or a combination of a lot of cards in the back row, but they didn't have a way to negate trap effects, then you can gain a ton of advantage by making your opponent get rid of all their cards. The removal from Evenly Matched forces your opponent to get rid of their cards and banish them face down, which is probably one of the best forms of removal, as it bypasses almost all kinds of protection. Not even Ultimate Falcon is immune to the effects of Evenly Matched. And if you use the effect from your hand, you can just simply enter the battle phase, and then leave the battle phase to get rid of all but one of your opponent's cards, since it counts your Evenly Matched in the field as your one card. Then you can do all your plays like normal during the main phase 2 in order to set up your board. You do have to give up your main phase 1 and battle phase to use the card, but the amount of advantage you gain from wiping your opponent's entire field of indestructible monsters is kinda worth it. Evenly Matched was then followed by some more good going second cards, which made the strategy way more viable than trying to rely on just drawing a copy of Evenly Matched, thanks to cards like Dark Ruler No More and of course Lightning Storm. Evenly Matched was influential in the fact that it made going second advantageous, where multiple people playing going second decks will not want to go first at all, which was rarely a thing before Evenly Matched was released. And at number 6, we have Maxi. This is a hand trap which was released in 2011, and has the effect where you can use this during either player's turn, and you gain the effect for the rest of the turn, where each time your opponent special summons a monster, you get to draw one card. Maxi is easily the strongest hand trap in the game's history, and it's kind of funny that when the card first came out, it rarely saw competitive play. It did see some competitive play, but it wasn't until later on where the problems of the card really became apparent, and the card got banned for just being too influential in its power. Basically, Maxi is so powerful that it changes the game around itself, kind of like Nibiru the Primal Being. The game literally just slows down if Maxi exists in the game, because if you start special summoning your monsters and your opponent drops a Maxi, they can chain it in response to you about to special summon a card, in order to immediately gain the advantage back of using that Maxi. So even if you stop your turn immediately so your opponent can't draw a whole bunch of cards, then you don't actually lose any advantage for using the Maxi, which is not the case for pretty much every other hand trap. And also, if you stop your turn so that your opponent doesn't draw a whole bunch for Maxi, you're basically stopping your turn early thanks to the effect of one card. It simultaneously allows you to force your opponent to stop special summoning for the rest of the turn while not losing hand advantage and potentially forcing your opponent to skip their turn, which is one of the most powerful effects in the game. Currently, Maxi is banned in the TCG and unbanned in the OCG, and the game is basically warped around Maxi in the OCG. Maxi just increases the power level of control decks that don't like to special summon a lot. It makes cards which can directly counter Maxi way more viable and necessary to open up with first if you don't want to lose to that one card, like a Call by the Grave or Crossout Designator. Maxi basically creates a game state where you need to have a counter for the card, otherwise you're going to lose out on your turn. And there's no real playing around the card like you can with Nibiru, unless you're able to special summon a whole bunch of times during your turn in order to deck out your opponent by taking the Maxi challenge, which was even mentioned in an official manga chapter. And at number 5, we have Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon is a level 5 monster which can special summon itself from your hand if your opponent controls a monster. Now, definitely nowhere near as powerful as Maxi, but it was a game changer, and this list is all about cards which change the game and not about the power level of the cards themselves. However, Cyber Dragon, when it was first released in 2005, was kind of overpowered in its time period. 2005 was still the era of 1900 attack beatsticks, and where tribute summons were still common even if Summon Skull Beatdown wasn't a competitive deck anymore. So if your opponent summoned out a big 1900 attack beatstick, then you could bring out Cyber Dragon and instantly beat over it, while you just normal summoned your own 1900 attack beatstick, and your opponent would have a hard time getting back from that loss of advantage. Cyber Dragon was so oppressive as a free monster you can bring out from your hand, back in the time when special summons were still pretty rare, that some people would just straight up not summon monsters during their first turn if they didn't have an answer to a potential Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon was also just used as tribute fodder, that way they can go into bigger boss monsters like Jinzo, and can be used later on in the graveyard for cards like Chaos Sorcerer since it was light attribute. And since Cyber Dragon acted as both a powerful free card to get on the field in order to extend, or just a really strong card to use as tribute fodder, the rest of the game kind of had to catch up to Cyber Dragon's power level. Cyber Dragon was absolutely a staple card, and was even limited on the ban list for a while during the Synchro era, because it was too strong at 3 copies, but never strong enough where it was ban-worthy. Then, Cyber Dragon got a lot of support later on in its life, which led it to be a normal card in a rogue meta deck. So sure, most people today know of Cyber Dragon since it still sees competitive play, but probably don't remember how absolutely game-changing it was when it came out. Its power level was so high that the rest of the game had to catch up to it in a hurry, and popularized the use of special summoning monsters from your hand for combos as normal part of the game. And at number 4, we have that Grassle Greener. This is a spell card which allows you to send a number of cards from your deck to the graveyard, equal to the surplus difference in your deck size to your opponents. So if you had 60 cards in your deck and your opponent had 40, you could send the top 20 cards of your deck to the graveyard. And with how many ridiculously good graveyard effects there are in the game, sending the top 20 cards of your deck to the graveyard could be equivalent to going plus 20 in card advantage. So it's an incredibly good effect to get off, which is why when that Grassle Greener was legal in the TCG, people were playing cards like Left Arm Offering, which gets rid of your entire hand to search out one spell card, just to search it out, and it was absolutely worth that cost. Now, the way this card changed the game was popularizing the use of 60 card decks, which is still sometimes a thing in the modern game, but it was a different story when that Grassle Greener was still legal, because that Grassle Greener decks could gain so much advantage for just resolving a single card, that a good way to counter the card was to just play 60 card decks yourself. If you had a 60 card deck, then your opponent wouldn't really get anything from resolving that Grassle Greener, and you could completely counter the whole point of their deck during the deck building process. And because of this, a lot of decks just started playing the max cap of 60, even if they didn't want to. And decks which could take advantage of having more than 40 cards were performing a lot better in this era, of more and more people just running 60 card decks to counter that Grassle Greener. Grass was so strong it changed how people constructed their decks. And I think this is a first, where people change the amount of cards they played in their deck because of one card in the game. Even if your opponent didn't have that Grassle Greener, chances are you would go against another person who also had a 60 card deck, not because they were playing the card, but because they were trying to counter it as well. After that Grassle Greener finally got banned, 60 card decks basically disappeared overnight. They still exist, don't get me wrong, but only if they directly can benefit from having that many cards, as it's still better to run the minimum amount possible so that you can actually draw the combo pieces you need. And at number 3, we have Malignant Catastrophe. This is a trap card which has the effect that when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can destroy all spell and trap cards in the field. So it's a full Heavy Storm-like effect. The way this card changed the game was how people place their spell and trap cards. You see, if your opponent has back row, or any cards in the field, or really anything at all, and you have traps or quick play spell cards you want to set to be able to use during your opponent's turn, you hold on to those before you enter the battle phase. Pretty much everyone sets their spell and trap cards during their main phase too who aren't Duel Links players, and Malignant Catastrophe is the reason why. If you set your cards in your main phase 1, then attacking into this card, you would lose all your cards, which could easily be prevented by just waiting until your main phase 2 to set them. Raiko the Lightsworn Hunter also partially contributed to the status as well, as it was a very popular flip effect monster which could target back row in addition to monsters when it was flip face up. So if you had any set back row and you attacked into Raiko, chances are you would lose one of your spell and trap cards, because Lightsworns could just blow up your monsters pretty easily before the era of everyone having monster negates. So Malignant Catastrophe causing people to change when they set their spell and traps is definitely deserving of a high spot on this list of cards that changed how players play the game. And at number 2, we have Gores, the Emissary of Darkness. This is a card which has the effect that if you don't control any cards on your side of the field and you take damage, you can then special summon this card from your hand and activate one of its 2 effects based on the type of damage you took. Where you can either inflict damage to your opponent equal to the amount of effect damage you took, or if it was battle damage, you get to summon a token which has the same attack and defense as the amount of damage you took. So the way this card changed the game was how your opponent attacks with their monsters directly during the battle phase. Since Gores can summon a really beefy token based on the amount of damage you take, if you're attacking into your opponent directly and they have no cards in their field, and you attacked with your strongest monster first, then they would bring out Gores and get a super strong token that none of your other monsters would be able to attack over. So the way to counter Gores is to simply attack with your lowest attack monsters first, ascending to your highest monsters last. This will force your opponent to activate Gores early if they're trying to bring them out to stop you from lowering their life points to 0, in which case you can more readily attack over the token and potentially Gores himself, which has pretty beefy stats for a monster that can special summon itself from the hand. Even if Gores doesn't really see play in the modern era, longtime Yu-Gi-Oh fans will still attack with their lower attack monsters first and higher attack monsters last, just in case. And at number 1, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. This card was so impactful that Konami basically created the forbidden list for it. The original effect of this card was you could pay 1,000 life points in order to send all cards in the field in both players' hands to the graveyard, and then inflict 300 points of damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard with its effect. It could also bring itself out really easily by just banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard. So it's one of the most powerful effects ever printed on a monster. And the best way to take advantage of this to make sure you were going to win that turn was to make sure one of the cards you sent to the graveyard was Sangan so that you could search out Yata-Garasu. Then you could just summon and attack with Yata-Garasu in order to make your opponent not draw cards during the next draw phase, and then just repeat infinitely until your opponent's life points reach 0. Because unless your opponent had a response in the graveyard, there was nothing they could do to come back from the combo. And generally, Konami doesn't like it when you're put in a game state where there's literally nothing you can do to come back. So they heavily restrict the cards which allow you to skip your opponent's draw phase, like Yata-Garasu or Time Seal. Both of these cards are still forbidden on the ban list to this day. Although Chaos Emperor Dragon was definitely the problem part of the combo, because it so easily allows you to set up an empty field in hand in order to lock down your opponent. If the card was unbanned with its original effect, it would still be one of the strongest cards in the game even today, almost 20 years after it came out. That's why the effect was changed to be a heavily nerfed version of itself, where it basically locks you out of using any card effects during the turn you use its effect, which was enough for them finally take the card off the ban list. Although the forbidden list exists in the first place because of how strong the card was. They basically had to make a way so that you could no longer use its super powerful effect at all, because this was before they would errata cards. So for creating the forbidden list, Chaos Emperor Dragon is a good spot to take number 1 on this list. In this video, we'll be going over confusing card mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! Generally, things that confuse new players to the game, and even a few things that veteran players forget about. And at number 10, we have Dark Worlds. Just the whole archetype. It's very confusing for new players because it doesn't work exactly the way you think. Let's go over Beige Vanguard of Dark World. It's one of the most simple out of all of them, and what it does is if this card is discarded to the graveyard by a card effect, you get to special summon it from the graveyard. Pretty simple effect, so if you use the effect of Raigeki Break, it allows you to discard one card to destroy one card in the field. You'd think that would be good enough to activate the effect of Beige, and you'd be wrong. Why? Because Raigeki Break discards as a cost, and Dark World specifically need to be discarded by an effect. And what separates an effect from a cost? Well, understanding the text of a card very carefully. Cards like Dark World Lightning have an effect, which allows you to target one set card in the field and destroy it, then it allows you to discard one card. And since the discard is after the destruction, that's actually the effect of the card, which would allow you to activate Dark Worlds. There's also a card like Card Destruction, which forces both players to discard all cards from their hand and then draw the same number of cards that they discarded, which does activate the effects of Dark Worlds because these two effects happen simultaneously, and therefore are part of the effect where neither one of them is a cost. And then you have cards like Temple Block, which requires you to discard one card first in the card text, then special summon 2 monsters, which does allow you to activate Dark World effects, because the effects happen simultaneously, and it's a confusing mess to understand why. But basically, it's because it doesn't say then in its card text, and simply continues on to the effect without any kind of wording to imply that it happens afterwards. So, because Dark Worlds were so confusing to activate, they kind of released another archetype called the Fables, which activates when they're discarded by both cost or card effects, which probably just confuses new players even more, that there is a whole series of cards out there which do activate from being discarded with Raigeki Break, but that doesn't work with Dark Worlds. And at number 9, we have Missing the Timing. So, what this one means is if a card has an effect that only activates when it's sent to the graveyard, for example, as that's the most common way this effect happens, there is a chance that you just can't use the effect under certain circumstances. For example, the entire Yang Xing archetype. They all have the effect which reads, when this card you control is destroyed by battle or card effect and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon one Yang Xing monster from your deck, which is a pretty simple to understand effect, but it can miss timing if it's not the last thing that happens. So say you have a Yang Xing monster on your side of the field, and then you use Dark Hold to try to destroy it so you can activate its effect. Then your opponent chains a Raigeki Break to your Dark Hole in order to destroy the exact same Yang Xing monster. Well, then the chain would resolve backwards, Raigeki Break would destroy your card, then Dark Hole would activate afterwards. And since the last thing that happened was the Dark Hole activating, you'd miss the timing of being able to use the Yang Xing. Another card, Blue Dragon Summoner, it has the effect that if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can add one monster from your deck to your hand. If Blue Dragon Summoner was destroyed under the exact same conditions, its effect would activate and allow you to search out a card. The difference between the two is that Blue Dragon Summoner has if in its card text, whereas the Yang Zing has when. Cards with if can activate in a more generous window as long as their conditions are met, whereas when cards need to activate immediately when their conditions are fulfilled, unless it's a mandatory effect, like Skull-Marked Ladybug for example. It has the effect, when this card is sent to the graveyard, increase your life points by 1,000 points. And since there's no option to activate this, it can't miss timing and will always go off. So some when cards miss timing and some don't. The way to remember it is whether or not the effect is optional. If it's an optional when effect, then it's very easy for it to miss timing with something like Soul Taker. But if it's a when mandatory effect, or an if effect, then it won't miss timing, and you just kind of have to memorize that in all the situations which cause when effects to miss timing. And at number 8, we have cards which cause infinite loops. This one is a little bit lesser known since there's so few ways to actually cause infinite loops in the game. But basically, there's a ruling in place where if you would do something that would cause an infinite loop, you're not allowed to do that thing, unless that thing is literally unavoidable, in which case you just destroy the card which is causing the loop. A lot to remember? Well, it's a lot easier if I show examples. Say we have pole position on the field. This card has an effect that only affects the monster on the field with the highest attack, in which case they become immune to spell card effects. So, if you have Elemental Hero Stratos on your side of the field, and the field spell card Sojin, this would increase the attack of your Stratos by 200, bringing it up to 2000 attack. But then pole position would make the card immune to spell card effects, which would bring it down to 1800, as it's no longer affected by the field spell card. So if your opponent summons a monster with more than 1800 attack, pole position would no longer work on Stratos and go to that card, which will allow the field spell card to increase his attack by 200. But if the monster your opponent summoned only had 1900 attack, then Stratos would have the new highest attack on the field, and it would cause an infinite loop of being unaffected and then affected by the field spell card with no change in game state, which would mean your opponent could not summon a monster with 1900 attack, because that would be considered causing an infinite loop. Another example, say you have Slifer the Sky Dragon on your side of the field. It has an effect where it gains 1000 attack for each card in your hand. If you have any equipped spell card on it that gives it attack and have pole position on the field, then the conditions which can increase the attack of Slifer become just drawing a card. So, if you have one card in your hand and Mage Power on Slifer, and of course pole position, that would give it 2000 attack. And if it was the highest attack, then it would go down to 1000, because it would lose the 1000 boost from Mage Power due to the effect of pole position making it immune to spell cards. But if your opponent had a monster with 2100 attack, you'd be fine, since it would be just low enough not to cause an infinite loop. But then, say, it's your turn, and you have to draw a card due to the mechanic of drawing a card at the start of your turn. This would cause Slifer to gain 1000 attack, which would bring it up to 3000, which would then cause pole position to take effect, and infinite loop with Mage Power to negate its effect, and then give it back because of the new card you just drew. And in this situation, you can't not draw a card for the start of your turn. So, in this unavoidable infinite loop, you would just have to destroy pole position. Pretty simple, right? Basically, just don't play pole position and you're good to go. And at number 7, we have non-targeting card effects. You see, some cards target monsters, and some cards have effects which make them immune to being targeted. And then there's some cards which only affect a limited amount of cards on the field, but technically do not target any of them. And the way you can tell a card that targets from one which doesn't is whether or not the card says that they target in their card text. Although not every card which targets says that they target. Take Catnip Kitty for example. It has an effect that reads, once per turn, you can make the defense of one monster your opponent controls 0 until the end of this turn. It doesn't say target anywhere in its card text, but it does indeed target. Or Medusa Worm. It has the effect that when it's flip summoned, destroy one monster on your opponent's side of the field. Doesn't say target, but it does. or Chaos Dragon Legionnaire. If it's brought up by banishing a combination of light and dark monsters from your graveyard, you can destroy up to 2 cards in the field. And this effect does not target, because you just kind of have to know these things. In fact, cards which can get rid of things without targeting are much more valuable because they get around targeted protection, and you can't really know which cards are going to be picked until the effect resolves, like with Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. When it's Synchro Summoned, you can banish up to 3 cards from a combination of your opponent's hand, field, and graveyard, but your opponent can't preemptively protect any of their monsters because you don't know which ones will be banished until it happens. Whereas if you use something like Caius the Shadow Monarch, which allows you to banish a card, you can get rid of the monster that's about to be banished to protect it with something like World Legacy Clash, since you have to target the card before it's banished. But that's not the case with Trishula. Now, most of the newer cards will say if they target or not, so it's only really an issue for older cards, which don't have the updated card text. And at number 6, we have Lingering Effects. A lingering effect is when a card gives another card an effect which isn't reliant on that card being on the field or in some other place. Like all token monsters who have effects technically have a lingering effect, and lingering effects cannot be negated. So if you bring out 4 tokens with Scapegoat under a skill drain, which normally negates the effects of all monsters in the field, the effect they have which prevents them from being tributed for a tribute summon is still in effect because you can't negate lingering effects. There is also the case where the Wild Monster appears. This card allows you to special summon normally very difficult to summon monsters from your hand, but it will then give them a lingering effect which returns it back to your deck during your opponent's next end phase. So if you bring out a monster which is immune to card effects, like Venominaga, the deity of poisonous snakes, even though it's immune to all card effects, it's not immune to lingering effects, since you can't be, and would still get returned to your deck if brought out with Wild Monster appears. Honestly, lingering effects aren't very difficult, you just can't negate them, but you can reset them. If you're able to flip a monster face down who has a lingering effect, then that lingering effect goes away. Or if a card is removed from the field and then it comes back, it loses the lingering effect. It's more about remembering that you can't negate a lingering effect, but there are ways around it. And at number 5, we have MST doesn't negate, but it can stop card effects. You see, there's a very common thing new players do, where someone activates a spell or trap card, they'll chain a card like Mystical Space Typhoon to it in order to destroy that card, and then be confused that the effect of Raigeki Break still goes off. Because just because you destroy a card doesn't mean its effect is negated. In fact, sometimes it could be useful to destroy your own cards in order to allow their effects to go off if they're about to be negated, or to just flip them face down. However, there are circumstances in which MST can stop an effect from activating. Say your opponent activates the field spell card Union Hanger, which allows you to add a light machine union monster from your deck to your hand when it's activated. If you chain MST to the activation of Union Hanger, it will be destroyed and not search out a card, because it needs to be on the field for the effect to activate and resolve. And if it's no longer there, then it doesn't work anymore. That's kind of the case for face-up spell or trap cards. So most field spell cards or continuous spell or trap cards have one of their effects stopped if you MST on it on activation. Like Fire Formation Tenki, it allows you to search out monsters at activation and can be stopped with an MST because it's a continuous spell card. But there is also a handful of non-continuous spell or trap or field spell cards that can also be stopped with MST. The quick play spell card Rage with Eyes of Blue has the effect where, when you activate this card, you have to banish this card and as many cards as possible from your hand, field, and graveyard face down. Then you get to special summon up to 3 blue eyes from your deck. Part of the condition of this card is that it has to banish itself. So if you MST the card, it will go to the graveyard and it won't banish itself, so the effect won't take place. Although even then, in these situations, it's not technically a negate. A negate is kind of like a keyword in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which means something very specific. More like effects just don't happen, which is kind of the same thing, but doesn't count as a negate for the purposes of cards like Power Angel Valkyrie, which has effects that activate when you negate the effects of cards. Those effects won't activate if you simply stop an effect from happening, since it's technically not a negate. And at number 4, we have effects that remember. This is kind of like a lingering effect, just a little bit more complicated. Say you use a card like Spell Reclamation, It allows you to activate it after you activate a spell card, which will allow you to add the spell card to your hand if it's sent to the graveyard. So if you activate it in response to a normal spell card, you'll be able to add it straight back to your hand. If you activate in response to a continuous one, you'll be able to add it back when it's eventually sent to the graveyard. But only once. If you use Spell Reclamation on Upstart Goblin, for example, which allows you to draw one card, it will go to the graveyard, and then you'll be able to add it back to your hand. And you'll be able to use it again immediately, but it will no longer be affected by Spell Reclamation because it forgot the effect, even though the conditions are still basically the same. The card says, whenever the spell card is sent to the graveyard, return it to your hand. It doesn't specify a limit, because it doesn't have to, because of the ruling. So it's basically lingering effects for spell or trap cards, and it can get really complicated with a handful of other stuff. Luckily, there are not a lot of cards that do this, so it's something you don't really have to worry about. And at number 3, we have properly special summoning. There are some cards which have effects that restrict them from being normal summoned or set, and then have a condition where they can only be special summoned under very certain circumstances. Take Stardust Dragon Assault Mode, for example. This card cannot be normal summoned or set, and has the condition where it can only be special summoned by the effect of Assault Mode activate, and cannot be special summoned by other ways except by its own effect as well, which means it has 2 ways to be brought out. So if you cheat this card out of your hand with a wild monster appears, then you activate its effect, which allows you to tribute itself in order to negate and destroy any card your opponent might be using, because then it has another effect, where if it sent itself to the graveyard with its negate, then it can special summon itself during the end phase from the graveyard. However, if this card was cheated out to the field with a wild monster appears, and wasn't brought out properly, then it won't special summon itself from the graveyard, even though it has an effect to special summon itself, and a clause that gives exceptions to its own effect to special summon itself, because the card needs to be brought out properly first. You see, you can cheat cards out of your deck, your hand, and the extra deck, but not from your graveyard or the banish zone, because of rulings where cards need to be properly brought out first. And this applies to monsters that don't even have effects. Like, say, you special summon the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon due to the effect of Fists of the Unrivaled Tenyi. Then Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon gets destroyed, and you want to use Monster Reborn to bring it out later. That won't work because it wasn't brought out properly first. Even though the card doesn't have an effect that restricts its summon, rulings just apply to it because it's an extra deck monster, and that's just how it works. So, if you brought it out properly through a fusion summon, and it was then sent to the graveyard, you would be able to use Monster Reborn to bring it back. And funny enough, if it was sent back to the graveyard after that, you'd be able to bring it out again because it remembers that it was brought out properly the first time. So you can keep bringing it out later, and it doesn't forget that it was brought out properly until it's reset back to the extra deck, or unless it's banished. So monsters can remember summoning conditions through lots of use and abuse, but not certain kinds of effects, which just adds more confusion to the remembering rulings. And at number 2, we have Synchro Summoning from the Graveyard, or just Blackwing Value the Emblem of Honor, since this is the only card in the game that can do that. This card has the effect that while it's in your graveyard, you can target one non-tuner Blackwing monster in your graveyard, and then banish both this card and that target, and if you do, you get to special summon one Blackwing Synchro monster from your extra deck, whose levels equal the combined total of this card and the other Blackwing monster. But that Synchro monster has its effect negated. So, it's basically a Synchro Summon from the graveyard, since Value himself is a tuner, but the Synchro monster has its effect negated, but it doesn't count as a Synchro Summon, so if the card is brought out with Value the Emblem of Honor, and sent to the graveyard, you can't use Monster Reborn to bring it out later since it wasn't brought out properly. Also, since it's not a Synchro Summon, you can use it to bring out Blackwing Silverwing the Ascendant, even though it requires 2 or more non-tuners as its materials. You only need the 2 monsters from your graveyard to bring it out, which normally requires at least 3. And since it's not a Synchro Summon, it also gets under cards like Discord, which prevents Synchro Summons. And also, the summon is counted as just a card being special summoned by a card effect. So you can't actually stop it with Solemn Judgment, since it's not considered an inherent special summon like a Synchro Summon is. Basically, this one card caused so much ruling nightmares that they never created a similar card like it afterwards, which is why Vayu, the Emblem of Honor, is still the only card in the game that allows you to perform an extra deck summon from the graveyard. And at number 1, we have monsters which have effects that activate when they're given to your opponent. These are definitely some of the most confusing mechanics in the game, even though they're pretty straightforward once you know the mechanics. Take the card Santa Claus, for example. This card allows you to special summon it from your hand to your opponent's side of the field by attributing one of their monsters. And it also has the effect where if it's summoned this way, once per turn during the end phase of that turn, you get to draw one card. However, your opponent is the one that draws this card because the effect activates from their point of view. And it gets even more confusing when the effect happens to both players, like with Silent Wabi, a card that's pretty infamous for having a confusing effect, where this card allows you to special summon it from your hand to your opponent's side of the field. Then it has an effect which reads, when summoned this way, draw one card, and if you do, your opponent gains 2,000 life points. So, reading this card real carefully, what it actually does is allow your opponent to draw one card, and then you get to gain 2,000 life points, since it will be read from your opponent's point of view as soon as the first part of the effect is activated, where it goes to your opponent's side of the field. And then it has another effect where the hand size limit of the current card controller becomes 3. This one is a lot easier to understand because it's written in a way that you understand its effect is affecting your opponent when you give it to them. Now, the reason I put this one at number 1, even though a lot of the other mechanics are a lot more confusing, like remembering what a card remembers and forgets under what circumstances, is because even though I've made a whole bunch of videos that mention Silent Wabi, I still have to reread its effect to make sure I don't get it wrong, which should say something about how confusing it is, because you have to understand the mechanics of the card to even be able to read the effect correctly. In this video, we'll be going over cards which require other cards and monsters in order to bring them out, but are generally worse than their base versions, and you're better off not bringing the cards out through the normal procedures and just using the original cards instead. So at number 10, we have Fusionist. This is a really simple card in order to kind of explain what we'll be doing in this list. Fusionist is a really low-statted level 3 fusion monster, which requires the cards Petite Angel and Mystical Sheep number 2 as its 2 materials, where you need to use Polymerization fusing these 2 monsters in order to bring it out. Or you can cheat the card out of the extra deck with cards like Instant Fusion or Ready Fusion, which is definitely the best way to use the card as its generic level 3 monster, if you need level 3 monsters for some kind of extra deck plays. However, bringing this card out through the normal procedure of using Petite Dragon and Mystical Sheep number 2 with Polymerizations is not really worth the effort, unless you just have a ton of card advantage and want to special summon a monster, and just happen to have Polymerization all those cards in your hand at the same time. Because if you look at the stats of Mystical Sheep number 2, it has the Beast type, the Earth attribute is level 3, and has 800 attack and 1000 defense. Fusionist has all of these same exact stats, except it has 100 more attack, but 300 less defense. Which means Mystical Sheep number 2 has 200 more stats total than its fusion counterpart card, where the only thing Fusionist has going over one of its materials is an incredibly minor 100 attack boost, where even 900 attack is so low that it's not worth mentioning. In the earliest version of the game, back in the OCG with official cards, the maximum attack for the first set was 1200 with Hitotsumi Giant. So, even the lowest power level version of the game possible, 900 attack was still not very good. And in fact, having a 1000 defense wall was probably better. Fusionist just straight up has less stats than one of its materials, which is kind of hilarious considering it's supposed to be a fusion card, which is a combination of 2 cards made stronger, has fusion in its name, and its card artwork is probably the most fusion-like of all the early vanilla fusion monsters, as it's a cat with wings and a different colored tail. There is another card which shares a distinction of Fusionist called Mavelous, which is another vanilla fusion monster that has less stats than one of its counterparts, where it only has 100 more attack than Tyhone, and 500 less defense, meaning it has 400 less stats total than one of its fusion counterparts. And I did look through all of the early fusion monsters, and these are the only 2 I could find that had this little distinction. Pretty much all the other ones had better stat lines, where the stats of the one fusion monster was better than both of its materials. There's a reason nobody really used fusion monsters in the early days of duel monsters. And at number 9, we have Neospacian Marine Dolphin. This is a level 4 fusion monster who only has a single card as its materials, as what you have to do is have Neospacian Aqua Dolphin on your side of the field, and then activate the specific normal spell card called Nex. That allows you to send a Neospacian monster you control to the graveyard in order to special summon a level 4 monster of the same name as that monster from the extra deck. Because the first effect of Neospacian Marine Dolphin is that its name is always treated as Neospacian Aqua Dolphin, which just starts the first of a couple of bad things about this card. Where because of the gimmick of the Nex cards, where they summon cards that have the same name as themselves, it really conflicts with the whole 3 cards per name in your deck rules. Because if you have Neospacian Marine Dolphin in your extra deck, that means you can only have 2 copies of Neospacian Aqua Dolphin in your main deck. So the inherent fusion mechanic used with these cards limits their consistency immediately, without even talking about their unsearchable fusion card Nex, which is required to bring it out and just makes it more difficult. The effect of the original Neospacian Aqua Dolphin is that once per turn you can discard 1 card from your hand and or look at your opponent's hand, and then you can destroy 1 monster in your opponent's hand that has an attack less than the attack of 1 monster you control. Then you can inflict 500 damage to your opponent. But if you do not find a card, you instead take 500 points of damage. Neospacian Aqua Dolphin was actually used competitively for a couple of years because it was really good at getting rid of low attack hand trap monsters from your opponent's hand, and could be special summoned from the deck easily with Neospace Connector. The effect of Neospacian Marine Dolphin is literally exactly the same, only with one difference. That is, if you do not find a card in your opponent's hand, you don't take 500 points of damage. So all it does is remove the negative side effect of taking 500 points of damage, which is kind of hilarious because the important cost of the card is definitely that discard cost. Taking 500 damage if you fail to find a card and destroy it is nothing. If it instead removed the discard cost, or at the very least allowed you to target any monster in your opponent's hand, instead of just a monster with a lower attack than a monster you controlled, it might be an improvement. But since all it does is remove a minor negative from the original card that no one cared about, it's just straight up a downgrade over the original, which was a great combo tool for ripping cards out of your opponent's hand, whereas Neospacian Marine Dolphin is a clunky to use fusion monster that is inherently inconsistent with just its summoning method. However, even though Neospacian Marine Dolphin is clearly inferior to its base version, it does technically have more attack and defense than its original counterpart, and it does technically have a better effect, which is why it's only at number 9 on this list, even if everything else about the card is actually just terrible, and you would never want to play this card with the original in any way, shape, or form unless you were trying to do it as a punishment. And at number 8, we have Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon. This is a level 8 monster whose effect is only a summoning condition, where you can special summon this monster from your deck by tributing a Red Eye's Black Dragon monster equipped with Metalmorph. Red Eye's Black Dragon is a 2400 attack vanilla monster with a crap ton of support cards, so it's actually pretty easy to bring out. And Metalmorph is a normal trap card, which can be equipped to any face-up monster you control, where it has the effect of granting that monster 300 extra attack and defense, and if the monster attacks another monster, it gains half the attack of its target during damage calculation, which is actually a really good effect of allowing you to beat over pretty much anything. So if you're able to equip Red Eye's Black Dragon with Metalmorph, you then meet the conditions to summon Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon from your deck, and can then remove those cards from your field in order to bring it out, where you have a non-effect monster with 100 more attack, and that's about it. If you just leave Red Eye's Black Dragon with Metalmorph equipped on the field, it's actually better, because then it still has the effect of Metalmorph, which allows it to attack over pretty much anything. Where the card specifically made for that combo is actually worse, because for some reason it doesn't also have the Metalmorph effect, despite obviously being made as a card that was supposed to interact with Metalmorph. There's also one other card in the game called Zoa, which has 200 more attack than Red Eye's Black Dragon, has flavor text that says its potential can be achieved if outfitted with Metalmorph, and also has Metal Zoa, which functions in the same way as Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon. However, this potential that is mentioned in its flavor text seems more ironic that they're better off if you just leave Metalmorph on them without bringing out the evolved version from the deck. There is one neat thing going on for these cards though, and that is the fact that the cards special summon themselves from the deck without requiring additional steps. If you just get Red Eye's Black Dragon on the field and equip it with Metalmorph, then you can just bring out Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon directly from your deck without any other fuss, which is actually pretty unique. Most boss monsters that have convoluted summoning requirements don't allow you to bring themselves out, and usually requires some other middleman spell card like Magical Labyrinth. And technically it does have 100 more attack than Red Eye's Black Dragon would have if it was equipped with Metalmorph, discounting the battle-related effect, of course, even if it is strictly worse from a gameplay perspective of bringing it out. The only good thing that came out of Red Eye's Black Metal Dragon was its future retrain card, Red Eye's Darkness Metal Dragon, which was one of the best dragon monsters ever made. And at number 7, we have Sandwich. This is a level 6 fusion monster with no effect that has 2100 attack and actually has more stats than either of its materials. The problem with this vanilla fusion monster is the fact that both of its materials used to bring it out were game-changing cards that were forbidden for years and only came off the ban list after getting an errata. As both of the cards that are required for this card are Sandgan and Witch of the Black Forest, where both of these cards have the effect that, if they're sent from the field to the graveyard, you get to add one monster from your deck to your hand, just as long as that monster had less than 1500 attack in Sandgan's case, or less than 1500 defense with Witch of the Black Forest. So you would think a fusion monster that combines the two best monster searchers from early Yu-Gi-Oh! That it should have some kind of effect that allows it to search things out. Instead, it has literally nothing. It's really a head-scratcher why this card doesn't have an effect at all, considering the two materials it has are clearly all about searching. However, since its two materials are technically good, and they are named materials on this card, it could be comboed with cards like Fusion Reserve in order to search out Sandgan or Witch of the Black Forest, or even cards like Future Fusion in order to get those cards to the graveyard so you can use them for other plays. And at number 6, we have Elemental Hero Inferno. This is a fusion hero monster which has a negative effect where it can only be fusion summoned and can't be special summoned in other ways. And then has the good effect where, if it battles a water monster, it gains 1000 attack during the damage step only. And with a baseline attack of 2300, that means it can beat over pretty much any water monster by battle. Although bringing out a fusion monster that requires two specific named materials and only has restrictions on not bringing it out easier is definitely not a good enough effect to have for its summoning conditions. The effect is technically good, just really underpowered. However, one of its materials, specifically Elemental Hero Heat, can actually beat its fusion counterpart in attack points through its own effect. You see, Elemental Hero Heat has the effect where it gains 200 attack for each Elemental Hero monster you control. So if you have all 6 of your zones occupied with Elemental Hero monsters, as it does count itself, then its attack will be 2800, beating its fusion counterpart by 500 points. If you have only 4 Elemental Hero monsters in the field, it has 2400 attack, which also beats its fusion counterpart. The only way its fusion counterpart beats Elemental Hero Heat in attack points is literally if it's actually able to attack a water monster. But Elemental Hero Inferno is a terrible anti-support card, so it wouldn't really be used in those scenarios anyway. And at number 5, we have Dark Flare Knight. This is a level 6 fusion monster, which has 2200 attack and 800 defense, which is important because one of its materials is Dark Magician, which has 2500 attack and 2100 defense. So it falls cleanly into the category of just being weaker than one of its fusion counterparts, and is probably one of the most direct fusion monsters that fits this criteria, because at least Fusionist has 100 more attack than one of its materials, even if it has lower overall stats. And Dark Flare Knight also requires a fusion monster as its other material, which made it even more difficult to summon through its normal procedure. However, since Dark Magician is one of the most supported cards in the game, there are ways to get this card out easier, but its effects are also just not super good either. As what it does is, 1, you take no battle damage from battles involving this card, and if it's specifically destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 Mirage Knight from your hand or deck. Mirage Knight is a level 8 main deck monster whose effect basically makes it so it can only be special summoned by the effect of Dark Flare Knight, and then has the effect where if it battles a monster, it gains attack equal to the original attack of the monster it's battling. So actually pretty good effect. It's basically honest but always on. However, the card then banishes itself during the end phase if it attacked or was attacked. So you can only really have it on the field for 1 battle phase. And while Mirage Knight is really good at battle, it's not good enough to be worth the effort of going into Dark Flare Knight and protecting it so that it's destroyed specifically by battle and not any other kind of card effects. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh! There are so many different ways to actually get rid of a card from the field that trying to get Dark Flare Knight destroyed by battle is kind of an achievement in of itself. The only thing going well for Dark Flare Knight is the fact that it's part of the Dark Magician archetype, so it has a plethora of support, and is not that hard to bring out if you're playing a gimmick deck, even if it's not better than just one of its materials. And at number 4, we have Steam Gyroid. This is another non-effect fusion monster that has 2 effect monsters as its materials, which are Gyroid and Steamroid. We can kind of ignore Gyroid to an extent, as the important part of the segment is the other material. However, Gyroid is worth mentioning a little bit, because its effect is actually good, where once per turn it just can't be destroyed by battle. The other more important material is Steamroid, which is an 1800 attack level 4 monster that has the effect where if it attacks an opponent's monster, it gains 500 attack during the damage step only. However, if it's attacked by an opponent's monster, it loses 500 attack. What this means is if Steamroid tries to attack over one of your opponent's monsters, it effectively has 2300 attack in those scenarios, which is 100 more attack than Steam Gyroid, its fusion counterpart. So if Steam Gyroid and Steamroid were facing off in a battle against each other, Steamroid would be able to destroy its fusion counterpart in battle. So it's kind of a wonder why they just straight up did not give its fusion counterpart any effects, because it's clearly not worth going into for its stats, because you're probably better off just using Steamroid instead. If Steam Gyroid had both of the effects of its counterparts, where it couldn't be destroyed by battle once per turn and gained attack while it was attacking, it might have actually been an improvement over one of its materials. And at number 3, we have Armati, the Chaos Phantasm. This is a level 12 fusion monster which can only be brought out with contact fusion if you control its 3 specific named materials on your side of the field, where you have to banish those cards in order to bring this one out, and also has the effect that says you can't use other methods to bring it out. And its only effect is that it cannot be destroyed by battle, and gains 10,000 attack during your turn only. So if you're able to attack your opponent's monster that has 2,000 or less attack, then you can win with this one attack. However, the 3 monsters you have to have on your side of the field in order to bring this card out are all boss monsters that are difficult to summon in their own right. Uriah, Lord of Syrian Flames, requires you to send 3 face-up trap cards you control to the graveyard in order to summon it from your hand. Haman, Lord of Striking Thunder, requires 3 face-up continuous spell cards, and Raviel, Lord of Phantasms, requires you to special summon it by attributing 3 Fiend-type monsters. So you need 9 cards worth of materials in order to bring out its 3 boss monsters, where all 3 of those monsters have better effects on the field. Uriah, Lord of Syrian Flames, gains a 1000 attack for each continuous trap in your graveyard, and once per turn you can Night Beam one of your opponent's back row cards, where it can destroy it without your opponent being able to activate the card in response. Haman, Lord of Striking Thunder, has 4000 attack and defense baseline, which is a benefit in of itself because the card can be brought out by attributing 3 continuous spell cards. And if it destroys a monster by battle, you get to inflict 1000 points of damage to your opponent, and if it's in defense position, it redirects all your opponent's monster attacks to itself. And Raviel, Lord of Phantasms, is kind of the weakest of the bunch, as it's just a 4000 attack beat stick, which can tribute monsters to gain attack temporarily, and summons tokens when your opponent normal summons monsters. So the 3 materials of Armati all have a whole bunch of other effects on the field, and 2 of them have a baseline attack of 4000. So it's kind of a wonder why Armati itself is a sitting duck with 0 attack and defense during your opponent's turn. They could have made the card have 4000 attack and defense and just gained 6000 attack during your turn, and it would have been way better. But I guess they thought having a 10,000 attack monster would just be too strong back in the day when it first came out. Something they've definitely gotten over, seeing as they printed cards like Utopia Double. And Armati has almost no protection, because only being immune to battle destruction is kind of laughable on a hard to bring out boss monster, which will be removed with any form of disruption your opponent has. There's a reason when they tried to give support to the Sacred Beast archetype, they created a brand new fusion monster called Armati the Chaos Phantasm, Phantom of Fury, where it has the same materials as the original, except without the negative effect of only locking you into its normal procedure, where it has the effect that its name is treated as the original card, and you can give this card to your opponent where it will then banish itself and all the cards your opponent controls during the end phase in order to cheat out the original card from your extra deck to your side of the field, ignoring its summoning conditions. So it's also not super good, but it is at least an improvement over the original, while making it easier to bring out the original. And at number 2, we have Gate Guardian. This is a really high-statted main deck monster whose only effect is its summoning condition, where it can only be special summoned from your hand by attributing its 3 specific named monsters on your side of the field. And just like Armati, its 3 materials required are all kind of hard to bring out, as they're level 7 monsters that don't have inherent special summon conditions. Although the 3 monsters don't have negatives that make them hard to bring out, and they all actually have pretty good effects on the field. Where if either of the 3 cards are attacked by an opponent's monster, you can make your opponent's monster's attack become 0, which will kind of guarantee the monster will be destroyed if it tries to attack one of them. The 3 monsters can only use their effect 1 time total, but generally that will be enough of a deterrent where your opponent won't want to attack any of them in the first place. And the only benefit you get for bringing out Gate Guardian is just having a lot of attack points at 3750. However, what makes Gate Guardian worse than a lot of fusion monsters is the fact that you do need to also search out Gate Guardian itself in order to bring it out, in addition to getting its 3 specific named monsters on the field, which increases the difficulty of bringing this card out exponentially. And the only place you'll actually see this card in any kind of play is in Duel Links, where they have a skill in the game that's specifically designed to only bring out Gate Guardian, and kind of leave you with nothing else, as it starts to duel with 3 of its materials on the field and Gate Guardian in your starting hand. But you have 500 starting life points and no other cards in your starting hand, and the skill is not very good for obvious reasons. And at number 1, we have Exodia Necrons. This is a level 4 monster with 1800 attack that can only be special summoned with a specific spell card called Contract with Exodia. And Contract with Exodia can only be activated if you have all 5 copies of the Exodia pieces in your graveyard, where it will then allow you to special summon Exodia Necrons from your hand. So you don't even get to bring it out from the deck, which requires you to search the card out, kind of like Gate Guardian. Although Exodia Necrons is even harder to bring out because it requires you to get 5 named specific different monsters from your deck to the graveyard first. And getting 5 specific monsters in the graveyard is an achievement in of itself, as most cards that allow you to send specific cards from your deck to the graveyard are limited or banned, because the effect of sending specific named cards from the deck to the graveyard is actually really good in the modern metagame. So as the game advances, it gets harder and harder to bring out Exodia Necrons. However, what do you get if you're able to bring out this hard to bring out boss monster? Well, you get a card which cannot be destroyed by battle, nor can it be destroyed by the effects of spell and trap cards. And once per turn, during your standby phase, it will gain 500 attack permanently. So a monster which can't be destroyed by battle that gains 500 attack every turn would be pretty okay on a monster that could just normal summon itself without any kind of restrictions, though it probably wouldn't see any competitive play. And the protection the card has is kind of laughable, as it only applies specifically to spell and trap effects which destroy, and doesn't make it immune to just spell and trap effects. So if you hit Exodia Necrons with a Karma Cut or Paleozoic Dynamiscus, then it's removed pretty easily. Not even mentioning the fact that it can be destroyed by any monster effect, since it has no protection against monster effects at all. The level 4 monster, Cosmal Wicked Witch, has better protection than Exodia Necrons, has more baseline attack, and can be normal summoned with no problems. And Exodia Necrons also has a negative condition, where if any of the 5 pieces of Exodia are removed from your graveyard, the card will destroy itself. And this card is also worse than the materials used to bring it out, because if you're able to get the 5 pieces of Exodia in your hand, you instantly win the duel. And in fact, there's a lot of cards that allow you to recover cards from the graveyard, and even some Exodia support cards. So, if you do have the 5 cards in the graveyard required to bring this card out, you're much better off trying to get those cards into your hand rather than keeping them there for Exodia Necrons. So Exodia Necrons is way worse than the materials required to bring it out, because it's kind of just a bad boss monster, which wouldn't even see competitive play if it didn't have any restrictions on its summoning condition, and could just be normal summoned with its current beneficial effects. In Yu-Gi-Oh, cards will get erratas to their effects for a number of reasons. Usually it's to clean up their card text so it's not so long and convoluted, and sometimes it's to change effects or add limitations. And in this list we'll go over 10 of the cards who had the most amount of changes for whatever reasons. And at number 10, we have Kinetic Soldier. When this card was first released, it had the effect where, when this card battles with a warrior type monster, increase the attack and defense of this monster by 2,000 points only during damage calculation, which is a pretty easy to understand effect, even with its old wording on it. So in its first errata, its effect was changed to be a little bit more simplified, which simply says, when battling a warrior type monster, this card gains 2,000 attack and defense during damage calculation only. So basically, same thing, just less words, and that'll be the gist of a lot of these cards on this list. And I won't bore you by reading out every single little change. There was one other little thing about this card though. Its attribute was changed from Earth to Light. Yeah, that doesn't happen very often. It is incredibly rare that a card's attribute or type changes during an errata, and Kinetic Soldier was one of those very few cards, because it was given out as a World Championship promotional card, and then when they released it in normal packs, they gave it an updated card text and a completely different attribute. But that's not all. This card has had a total of 5 erratas to it, which make it tied with the bottom 4 spots on this list, as this card got another errata, where its attribute was changed back to Earth, and a comma was removed from its card text. Now, you see what happened was they accidentally changed its attribute to Light. It was supposed to be an Earth monster all along, and this has only happened one other time with Nitro Warrior, where it was originally printed as a fire type and then was misprinted in its second set to be of the wind attribute. So even though there's 2 different versions of Kinetic Soldier out there with 2 different attributes, all of the other erratas have Earth as well, so that's the attribute it's supposed to be. Although Kinetic Soldier's erratas don't stop there. It got a 3rd errata to update its problem-solving card text, then a 4th errata to do it again, and then a 5th errata which changed its name from Kinetic Soldier to Cypher Soldier. Because you see, in Japanese, its name is actually supposed to be Cypher Scout. And with the new Cypher archetype being released, Cypher Soldier retroactively gained a whole bunch of new support cards, which didn't actually work on him since his name was Kinetic Soldier. So when they release cards like Cypher Wing, which has the effects that interact with Cypher monsters, it had to specifically state that it works on Cypher monsters or Kinetic Soldier, since it was supposed to be part of that archetype. So instead of having little stipulations to every single Cypher card, they just changed the name of Kinetic Soldier to Cypher Soldier, which they were much more willing to do nowadays than they were in the past. So Cypher Soldier has had a colorful history of changes, despite the fact that its effect has not changed a single time over all 5 of its erratas. And at number 9, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. This card received a total of 5 erratas, and most of them were just fixing its text, since it's such an old card and had some of that old textbook wording, where in its very first version it forgot to say that it cannot be normal summoned or set. So in its original text was that it could be special summoned from your hand by banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard. And then you could pay 1,000 life points to send all cards in the field and in both players' hands to the graveyard, then inflict 300 points of damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard by this effect. And this ultra powerful card basically created the ban list just so they could get rid of that card from the game. Then, even though this card was banned for so long, it kept getting re-released, and then they would update its card text, where they basically just gave it proper problem-solving card text, all the way until its 5th errata, where they completely changed its effect. It still had the same summoning condition, but it had a little restriction added to it. One of them was that it only inflicted 300 points of damage to your opponent for each card sent to your opponent's graveyard by its effect, rather than all cards sent to the graveyard. And its other new restriction was you cannot activate other cards or effects during the turn you use this card's effect. It was due to this huge restriction to this card that it actually got unbanned, since part of the reason this card was so strong was its combo potential to completely screw your opponent over. Not being able to use any other card effects the turn you use its effect meant you couldn't use the card during the same turn you set up your graveyard, nor could you use any other card effects after using this effect, which essentially turned its original combo potential into a 3-turn strategy, which significantly slowed it down to the point where it's no longer broken. Not quite a whole bunch of colorful changes like what Cypher Soldier got, but this card did have its effect changed, while also receiving a whole bunch of updates its original effect before they threw that out. And at number 8, we have Ryko, the Lightsworn Hunter. This is a flip effect monster who's had a total of 5 erratas in its lifetime. Now, this is an interesting card. It basically got a buff to its effect with its errata, while also not really changing what this card was meant to do. So, in its original form, this card had a flip effect, where when it was flipped face up, you could use its effect to target one card in the field and destroy it, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, which was actually a pretty powerful effect back in the day. And Lightsworn decks love to send cards from their deck to the graveyard, and destroying cards is always good. In fact, it's partly because of Ryko that people started setting their spell and trap cards during their main phase 2, because if they set them during main phase 1, they could be destroyed if they attacked into this card. And in its original text, the way it destroyed the card was just by saying it can destroy one card in the field, so in its first errata, it was changed to say you can select one card in the field and destroy it, which was then changed in its second errata to you can target one card on the field. Basically, its effect was changed to say that this card does in fact target, in order to remove some ruling confusions, as back in the day, not every card which could target said that it could target. Then, in its third errata, its effect was changed to say that after you destroy a card, send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, in order to remove any other kind of ruling confusions. Because you see, the fact that this card had an effect which happened immediately after it destroyed a card meant it could cause other cards to miss timing. I remember back in the days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Online, when I was playing my Shining Hero Gate deck, which revolved around Elemental Hero the Shining, it had a floating effect which would activate when it was destroyed, that would allow you to add 2 Elemental Heroes that were banished to your hand. And I always hated attacking into Ryko because they would always destroy my Shining and cause it to miss its timing, so it wouldn't be able to add any cards back. And a lot of cards missed timing back in the day. So this card really got people to know the rules a lot better when it comes to timing, and the difference between when and if effects. Then, in its fourth errata, they really drove home the fact that the effects happen back to back, so that they can force cards to miss timing, as it was changed to say, apply these effects in sequence, target a card in the field and destroy it, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. That was all the way until its fifth errata, where they completely changed their mind on this long-standing effect, and did 3 things to the card. First, they gave it a flip type distinction, next to the fact that it was a beast and effect monster, since flip effect monsters themselves are their own special type of monster, and benefit from a whole bunch of support which specifically only works on flip monsters. Then, they changed its effect to apply both of its effects simultaneously, and this little ruling makes it so it no longer causes Elemental Hero the Shining to miss its timing, since it would destroy the card and send 3 cards from your top of the deck to the graveyard at the exact same time. However, at the same time, they gave it a buff, where the card no longer targets. The card now just destroys 1 card on the field, which means it can now destroy cards which are normally untargetable, like Obelisk the Tormentor for example, where in the past they would have been immune to this card's effect since it had to target. So that's why this card is a little weird. They simultaneously nerf the effect by having them both happen simultaneously, after having 2 iterations of this card specifically saying that they happen in sequence. And then they buff the card by removing its targeting condition after having 2 different versions of this card specifically changed to say that it does target. Basically, its last errata was just to completely undo everything that was set up by its first 4, in order to basically give it a new effect that also basically does the same thing, and the card doesn't really see play in Lightsworn decks anymore, so it doesn't really matter anyway. And at number 7, we have Toon World. This card had a total of 5 erratas, plus 1 if you count the errata this card had before it was translated into English in the TCG, giving it a total of 6 erratums. Now, the very first effect of Toon World, it had the effect where you had to pay 1,000 life points to activate the card. Then, you had to pay 500 life points during each of your standby phases to keep the card on the field. And if the card on the field was destroyed, you would gain all the life points back that you had paid for its maintenance cost. And in the first errata of this card, they changed all of that effect into just pay 1,000 life points to activate this card, which is quite the change in card text. And that's the version we got in English in the very first set that it was released. And then the card just got a whole bunch of updates to its card text, basically just different versions of wording of the card in the exact same way. And it was all very simple, just pay 1,000 life points to keep this card on the field. With some small changes like changing the text that it was a magic card into a spell card, when they did that for all spell cards back in the day. And nothing else really happened with this card. It's kind of amazing this card got so many erratas without changing its effect, but I guess it's kind of standard practice for cards that are iconic. And at number 6, we have Future Fusion. This card has had a total of 6 erratas, but only 1 effect change. In its original form, the effect of this card was basically, after the card was activated, you choose a fusion monster and then send the materials of that fusion monster from your deck to the graveyard. Then 2 standby phases after you activate this card, you would special summon that fusion monster and attach this card to it. And Future Fusion was really good in decks that wanted to get a whole bunch of cards in the graveyard immediately, so it was banned after a couple of years. Although it wasn't banned immediately, and it did stay around for a while, so we got some erratas to the card text. One that changed the text which told you to select a fusion monster from your fusion deck into the extra deck, back when they changed the name of the fusion deck to the extra deck. Then it just got a couple of other updates in similar veins, until its 5th errata, when they actually changed its effect. Its effect was still basically the same. You got to bring out a fusion monster after 2 standby phases. However, the difference was, you didn't actually send the monsters from your deck to the graveyard until 1 standby phase after you activated the card, instead of sending them all there immediately after using the card. So with this change, your opponent would have a full turn to destroy this card in order to prevent you from sending cards from your deck to the graveyard, which gave it enough counterplay where they were able to unban this card and eventually unlimit it, since that slowed it down enough where people just didn't play the card anymore. And then after its 5th errata, it got 1 more errata to shorten the text of graveyard to GY, and that's it. Not all these erratas are super interesting. I'd say a vast majority of them are just normal text changes, but even with just normal text changes, this is one of the most errated cards in the game. And at number 5, we have Brain Control. This card is at a grand total of 6 erratas, with one of them being a change to the card's mechanics. Now, in the first form of this card, it had the effect to pay 800 life points to select and take control of one face-up monster on your opponent's side of the field until the end phase. This card was then changed over the years to kind of clean up its card text a little, changing the word select to target, changing the word life points to LP, and a few other minor changes until its 6th errata, where this card was given a limitation, where you can only target a monster your opponent controls that can be normal summoned or set. Essentially, this makes it so you can't steal extra deck monsters with this card anymore, and was enough of a nerf to the card that it was able to be unbanned, and currently sees almost no competitive play at all, despite the fact that previously weaker versions of this card, like Mind Control, are currently limited to 1 for being too useful. This was just another case of a very iconic card, which was also a banned card that got re-released a whole bunch of times. They just updated its card text with problem-solving card text stuff before nerfing its effect with an errata. And at number 4, we have Y Dragonhead. This card has had a total of 6 erratas, with a change to the card's type, and a very rare buff to its effect. Now, the original version of this card was pretty standard Union Monster stuff. You could equip it to its specific Union Monster equip card, which in Y Dragonhead's case was X Head Cannon, and while it was equipped to that monster, it gained 400 attack and defense. If that monster would be destroyed by battle, you could destroy the equipped card instead, and once per turn, it could special summon itself as an equipped card to your side of the field. Although not on the same turn that it equipped itself, and you can only have one Union Monster equipped to a monster at a time. That's a pretty long mouthful of card text to basically say this card can only equip itself to one specific monster, and that one specific monster will just gain 400 attack and defense. Of course, there was other uses to this card other than its pretty mediocre Union effect, but those don't really have too much to do with its erratas. Now, a lot of the erratas to this card were just cleaning up its text to explain what it does in less words, or to clarify some things. Like in some of its older card texts, it would say that it could become a monster again, when referring to its effect as special summon itself as an equip card, which is a pretty funny card text if you ask me. Anyways, nothing really changed about this card all the way until its 6th errata, where this card was given the effect tag, as before this errata it only had machine/union in its card text, and kind of left out the fact that it was also an effect monster. Pretty minor thing that didn't really change anything. There was one other thing that did change with this card in its 6th errata, and that was the removal of the "a monster can only be equipped with one Union Monster at a time" clause. You see, before this errata, pretty much all Union Monsters had that little clause to their effect, and it was when they started releasing the ABC Dragon Buster cards that they just retroactively removed this restriction from Y Dragonhead and Z Metal Tank, who actually shares a spot on the list for having the exact same changes done to that card as a way to kind of buff Union Monsters. Since Union Monsters were almost never played for their Union effects, there wasn't really a reason to have that restriction on them anymore. So with them releasing a new set with good Union Monsters and cards, they buffed the 2 Union cards which also benefited from that new wave of support, by removing the restriction on their Union equips. This, however, does not retroactively remove the restrictions to all Union Monsters though. If a card says in its card text that only one Union Monster can be equipped at a time, then that's still the case. So a new wave Union Monster can be equipped to the same monster as another new wave Union Monster, but if they have an old wave Union Monster equipped to them, then you cannot equip one of the new waves to it as well, as the old one will restrict you from adding any other Union Monsters to them. Although Union Monsters are pretty bad, so no one's really using the old ones anyway, so this isn't really a concern. And at number 3, we have Catapult Turtle. This card has had a total of 6 erratas, with one of them changing the functionality of the card. The first version of this card was overly worded to explain its effect, which was pretty common in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! They basically had to explain some of the rules of the game in the card text. So its very first version read, offer one monster on your side of the field as a tribute to inflict direct damage equal to half of the tribute monster's attack to your opponent's life points. Monsters used for a tribute summon or that are offered as tributes due to other card effects are excluded. So in the first errata of this card, they just removed that last sentence completely, as it's not needed. They also removed the offer one monster on your side of the field as a tribute thing to just tribute one monster, like they did with all other cards that told you to offer a monster as a tribute. And then they turned the direct damage into just inflict damage, since all effect damage is basically direct damage. It wasn't really needed to explain that on the card text. Then it got a couple of other minor tweaks to it, with its 5th errata stating that it inflicts damage to your opponent equal to the tribute monster's attack on the field, which could be a buff to the card depending on how you look on it, as most cards that inflict damage based on a monster's attack only count their attack from the graveyard. And then its 6th errata was a nerf to its effect, as they slapped a soft once per turn on it. Whereas before, you could use its effect as many times per turn as you wanted, and it was involved in some FTKs in the past, so giving it a once per turn on its effect basically stopped that from happening completely. and you'd have to use something like Kinetic Soldier instead. And at number 2, we have the Twin-Headed Behemoth, who got a grand total of 7 erratas. One of them used to change its card effect in order to resolve a Ruling's Nightmare that this card created with its old text. Now, in its original card text, it stated that if this monster is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, this monster will be special summoned with an attack and defense of 1000 during the end phase of the turn. And then it also went on to say this effect can only be used once during the current duel, making this the first card in the game which had a once per duel effect, which is why they didn't really word this card correctly. Because you see, based on its wording, this copy of the card can only use the effect once per duel. But if you had other copies of the card, then those would also all have their own once per duel effects. So essentially, you could use the effect 3 times per duel if you had 3 copies. Where this caused a Ruling's Nightmare is, what do you do if one of the cards is returned to your deck? How do you keep track of which ones have already activated their effects that duel? Which is why they tried to rectify this card by a whole bunch of erratas and by limiting the card to 1 per deck. So its first change was you can only use the effect once in the duel, which still had the same problems as the original text. It just cleared up the card text a little. In its fourth errata, it was changed to each player can only use the effect of Twin-Headed Behemoth once per duel, which did finally fix the problem. They basically invented the hard once per turn clause, which involves literally printing the name of the card in the card's text to signify that you can only use the effects of that card's name once per duel. Then in its sixth errata, they removed the each player part and just said that you can only use the effect of Twin-Headed Behemoth once per duel, since the wording implied that your opponent could use it as well. And in its seventh and final errata, all they did was clarify its conditions for activating its effect, saying that if this card is sent to the graveyard because it was destroyed on the field and sent there this turn, then you could use its effect. So they only changed the functionality of this card one time when they properly gave it a hard once per duel effect, since you can't really have soft once per duel effects like it originally had, which it wasn't supposed to have, and only had those rulings because they kind of made the card incorrectly. This is one of the few times where a card was placed on the ban list because of its card text being too confusing. And at number 1, we have Necro Valley, who has had a grand total of 7 erratas. However, the functionality of this card changed about just as many times as its text. In its first version, the card was a magic card, which had the effect that, as long as this card remains face up on the field, all effects of magic, trap, or effect cards that involve graveyards are negated, and neither player can remove cards in the graveyard from play. In addition, increase the attack and defense of all monsters that include Gravekeeper in their card name by 500. So its original card text was kind of vague in what it actually did, as it just negated the effects of cards which involved the graveyard, which could really mean anything. Like, if you discard a card, does that mean it involves the graveyard? So a lot of the erratas of this card was to more or less really crack down on what exactly that line of text meant. So in its first errata, all mentions of magic cards were just changed to spell card, so nothing really changed there. It wasn't until its second errata where they started clarifying its card text a little, where now it said cards that affect a card or cards in the graveyard are negated, rather than cards that simply involve the graveyard. So simplifying it to cards that affect the graveyard does kind of limit the scope a little bit more than just cards that involve it, but it doesn't stop there. In its third errata, they removed a couple of sentences that weren't really needed, like how this card needs to be face up on the field, and that it increases the attack of Gravekeeper monsters, rather than being specific that it affects monsters with Gravekeeper in their card name. In its fourth errata, its effect was changed to negate the effects of cards that target a card in either player's graveyard, and that cards from either player's graveyards could not be removed from play. As before, it only ever talked about the graveyard, and never really specified if it worked for both players' graveyards. And it also changed the wording to cards which target stuff in the graveyard, rather than things that simply affect cards in the graveyard, which more significantly narrowed down what this card actually did once again. In its fifth errata, its effect was changed to cards in either player's graveyards cannot be affected by card effects except for their own effects, which really seemed like a step backwards in trying to specify what this card was, as it went back to cards that affect the graveyard rather than stuff that targets cards in the graveyard. And it did also exclude monsters who affect themselves in the graveyard, which meant monsters could activate their graveyard effects in a limited capacity. Then, what do you know? In its sixth errata, it got another clarification to its card text, or a change actually, where its new effect was negate any card effect which would move a card in the graveyard, other than itself, to a different place. It still had the effect where cards cannot be banished from the graveyard, so this allowed you to activate more graveyard effects than previously, like Glow Up Bulb for example, but a lot of graveyard effects require you to banish themselves in order to activate their effects, so it still shut down most of those. But it was a lot more specific on what it actually did now, as it's a lot easier to quantify effects that move cards around, rather than what it means to affect cards in the graveyard. Then, in its 7th errata, it got a change again. Or a buff, actually. It still had the same effects as the 6th errata. Cards in the graveyard cannot be banished, negate any card effects that would move cards in the graveyard somewhere else, but they removed the effect of cards being allowed to move themselves, which meant no more glow-up bulb effects. And on top of that, they gave it an extra effect to negate any card effect that changes types or attributes in the graveyard, which seems to be specifically designed to counter cards like Zombie World, which changes the types of all monsters in the graveyards to zombie type. And because of this 7th errata, this is one of the few cards in the game to actually receive a buff through its errata, as most of the times cards only ever get nerfs if an errata changes the card's functionality. And the only thing that stayed consistent about this card's effects for all of its erratas was the fact that it always gave Gravekeeper monsters 500 attack and defense, and it always prevented cards in the graveyard from being banished. It was the other effect of stopping cards from working with the graveyard that took a few tries for them to finally get it right, which easily makes Necro Valley the most changed card in the game, as almost all of its erratas were more than just simple text changes to decrease the bloat of extra words for the card, and basically changed how the card functioned multiple times over its lifespan, to the point where I'm pretty sure Necro Valley has had the most effect changes of any other card in the game, as well as having the most erratas. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an ever-changing game, with new and old cards coming out of the meta all the time. And in this video we'll go over cards which people thought would change the game, but ended up not doing much at all. Starting us off at number 10, we have Crystal Seer. This is a level 1 spellcaster which has 100 attack and defense, and when it's flipped you excavate the top 2 cards of your deck, and pick one to go to your hand, and then place the other on the bottom. Seer came out in the middle of the GX era, in a format dominated mostly by Monarchs. Rise of the Storm Monarch was one of the strongest tribute monsters at the time, letting you stack a card from the field on top of your opponent's deck, a deadly combo together with Phoenix Wing Windblast. Seer was hyped not only as a consistency tool, but also a reason for Monarch decks to go back to using Apprentice Engine. Apprentice Magician used to be the best recruiter to play since it could float into either itself, Old Vindictive Magician, who can pop a card on the field, or Magician of Faith, who can recover a spell from the graveyard. There were lots of parallels between the latter, in fact, since they were both level 1 spellcasters that got you back advantage, but Faith itself had been banned at the time. The issue with Seer is that its effect wasn't nearly as good to make up for its pitiful stats. Dekoichi had nearly the same payoff while also being usable as a beater. As a cherry on top, they even unbanned Magician of Faith for a format just a couple of weeks before Crystal Seer, its supposed replacement, dropped. All of this happened quite early in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and at least Pot of Duality, a card with a similar effect but on a spell card instead, did impact the game as much as Crystal Seer was expected to many years later, so this card is at a pretty low spot on this list. And coming in at number 9, we have Dark Worlds. The Dark World structure deck was set to be released in late 2011, and it had many powerful cards that looked like they would break the meta. This archetype is made out of a series of monsters that get their effects when discarded, but only when discarded by effects and not cost. So they don't work on cards like Raigeki Break, and also they gain bonus effects when discarded by an opponent's card. Silva and Gold had been seen play as tech against cards that discard random cards from your hand like Spirit Reaper and Don Zalug in earlier metas, but at the time the archetype didn't have enough engine to be played by itself. The new structure deck was supposed to change them, giving them strong consistency tools like Snow, who can add a Dark World card when discarded, and Gates of the Dark World, which lets you discard them for effect and draw a card at the same time. But the most hyped of them was certainly Grapha, which could only be special summoned by returning another Dark World monster from your field to your hand, and when discarded would let you pop a card on the field, all while being a 2700 attack beat stick. The hype was so much that even Konami hopped on it, who did their coverage of the next big event while roleplaying as Grapha itself on their blog. Players feared the deck, and after release, many would cite in many direct counters to the strategy in Shadow Imprisoning Mirror and DD Crow. All of this hype just for the deck to get 0 top cut slots in the next event, being heavily outclassed by other meta decks of the time, like Plant Synchro and Agents. Results which Konami tried to explain by saying that it was only because the new Dark World support card, Dark Smog, hadn't been released yet. Dark Worlds did go on to get a couple of tops later on, it just wasn't the dominant force it was made out to be at first. And number 8, we have another structure deck, the Layer of Darkness structure deck, named appropriately after its main card, Layer of Darkness. This is a field spell card that turns all monsters in the field to dark. Its main effect is that if you would tribute monsters to activate card effects, you can tribute your opponent's dark monsters for them instead. Then, during the end phase, the turn player gets as many torment tokens as possible in defense position up to the number of monsters tributed this turn. Tributing monsters as cost is still one of the most powerful forms of removal in the entire game, and this deck would allow you to do it without going minus, which was even better than using kaijus. The other cards revealed all synergize perfectly with the strategy, with the field spell searchers and ways to tribute off your opponent's monsters at quick effect speed. Additionally, field spell decks were much better back then because terraforming hadn't been limited to one yet. The deck came out first in the OCG, where it became a widely used strategy combined with Infernoids, an archetype where almost every monster needs a tribute to activate its effect, giving it perfect synergy with Lair. But when it finally came out to the West, it barely did anything. The issue was how powerful every other deck at the time was in comparison, with the likes of Sky Striker and Triple Engage, and Goki with both Isolde and Nightmare Mermaid. How can a deck that dies to a single MST compete? Some of the cards in the structure deck did end up seeing play in other decks, such as Lilith in trap-heavy strategies, or Diabolos as attack and Sky Striker at least. Still, despite the disappointment at first, Lair Infernoids did eventually manage to get a few tops in lower-powered metas as a rogue pick. And at number 7, there's Crossout Designator, a quick play spell that allows you to banish a card from your deck to negate the effects of cards with the same name until the end of this turn on a hard once per turn. Crossout's main use is negating hand traps like Ash Blossom and Nibiru, since you can't chain it to their activation on your turn as long as you play a copy of them yourself. This ability to negate hand traps is what made Called by the Grave see play in almost every deck, and even got it in the limited list. Even if you don't need to use it defensively, you can still set it and use it during your opponent's turn. This can be devastating in mirror matches, and there's always a chance you can use a negate a staple like Prod of Prosperity during your opponent's turn. This card saw a ridiculous amount of play in the OCG, and was even put on their ban list in the same month it was released in the West. All the anticipation made this card into the most expensive of its set, and then the card went on to see little play in the following months. The TCG and OCG metas are so different that Crossout didn't become nearly as much of a staple as it is over there. The main reason is because Maxi is not legal in the West, and the card by itself is a turn ender for every deck that special summons more than a couple of times, with Crossout being one of the few counters. So even though it was a staple over there, it was just a rare side pick inclusion here. Recently, Crossout's been mostly in Despia decks, since it's the only generic card that can counter both of its biggest counters. But that's still nothing compared to how it was in the OCG, who had to put it all the way down to 1 eventually. And at number 6, we have Natura Pineapple, a level 2 earth plant that turns all monsters you control into plants. Also, during your standby phase, if it's in your graveyard and you don't have any back row and only plants and beasts in the graveyard, it can special summon itself from the graveyard. The Naturias were a quite mediocre archetype at the time. Their situation was exactly like the Ice Barriers, where their synchros were good to play in other decks, but they didn't really work by themselves. Pineapple was supposed to fix that, being a TCG exclusive card released at the highest rarity available, just like the previous meta breaker Gateway the 6. This monster is extremely similar to Treeborn Frog, a card which had been a mainstay in the meta for a few years before itself. It was supposed to give you easy tribute fodder for the only good main deck Natura monster at the time, Natura Bamboo Shoot, which locks your opponent completely out of spell traps. The theorized Pineapple Cat deck made this Natura card hit really high prices at first, as it used Rescue Cat's engine to give Naturas more combo while staying within Pineapple's restriction. Not only did it not live up to the hype, Rescue Cat would also get banned just a couple of weeks after the card came out. There weren't any easy ways to set up Pineapple in the graveyard deck like Treeborn Frog had. Also, even if Bamboo Shoot actually had a good effect, it loses the effect completely if it got hit by Effect Veiler, which was a staple in almost every deck. Additionally, since its stats were on the lower side for tribute monsters, you'd need to run a lot of defensive cards to keep it alive, all of which would turn off your Pineapple due to its restriction. The deck just couldn't compete with the meta threats at the time, like X-Sabers, and once again, outside of their synchro monsters, the Naturas were forgotten. And at number 5, we have Magical Musketeers, a series of fiend monsters with a very interesting gimmick. They all let you activate Magical Musketeer spell traps from your hand while on the field, and then they have additional effect when a spell trap is activated in the same column as one of them. They were announced at the beginning of the Link era, and the Magi Bullets, as they were called at the time, were instantly propped up as the second coming of Zodiacs, which had just left the meta with the banning of Trident and Broadball. Caspar and Doc set your advantage engine by letting you get Magical Musketeer spells from both your deck and graveyard every turn. The deck even had a powerful draw effect with Kid Brave, and even Zodiac Barrage-like effect with Starfire. The spell trap lineup was no slouch either, with quick effect pops, graveyard disruption, and monster and spell trap negates. However, this deck could not possibly have been released at the worst time in the TCG, being dropped in the middle of a format mostly dominated by Spiral. The Magical Musketeer Advantage engine was good in theory, but there was no way to keep up with combo decks using tools like Ancient Fairy Dragon and Pre-Errata Fireball Dragon. When it came to the slower decks, the deck was worse than Trickstars, which had a much more compact engine as well as a way to win the game instantly with Reincarnation and Droll and Lockbird combo, banishing your opponent's whole hand. So the new Zodiacs were left to rot, never really finding their place competitively as the meta progressed and left them behind. They managed to secure themselves a few top spots years later, however, with the release of the Link monster in Magical Musketeer Max, before fading off completely again. And at number 4, we have Spell Chronicle. This is a continuous spell card that requires you to send your entire hand to the graveyard to activate it, and then it banishes 5 spell or trap cards from your deck. Then, each time your opponent activates the spell card, you place 1 Chronicle counter on it. You can remove 2 of these counters and let your opponent choose one of those banished cards to add to your hand. And if this card ever gets destroyed, you take 500 damage for each of the cards still banished by its effect. Despite sounding like some terrible pack filler, this card managed to get an amazing amount of excitement surrounding it years after its release in Duelist Alliance format. What happened is that, as a joke or otherwise, this card was hyped by multiple competitive players at once, with some even saying they were going to buy all copies of Spell Chronicle that they could. The most baffling explanations on why this card were good were given, such as being able to use it to trigger your Shadow effects, despite it sending cards for cost and not effect, so it couldn't even trigger the Shadow effects. This all resulted in the almost useless card skyrocketing in price from night to day, as everyone wanted to get their hands on the new meta as soon as they could. Even though the rest of the player base kept theorizing why this card was supposed to be so good, by thinking it should be used with Primal Seed to get cards back or trigger BA effects, no one could really figure out why it was supposed to be so good. This would only last a couple more days before everyone who bought in realized it was a joke and they had all been duped. The hype dissipated, and so did the discussion and price speculations around this card shortly after. Funnily enough, half a decade later, they actually released a card that comboed very well with this with the Witchcrafter's Patronus. After activating Spell Chronicle, it could be used to add all the cards back to your hand, as long as they were Witchcrafter cards. But even that was too inconsistent to ever see play. And coming in at number 3, we have Synchro Switch. This is a continuous spell that lets you, once per turn, move 1 monster on your side of the field to an adjacent horizontal unoccupied monster card zone. Even though this reads like one of the most do-nothing cards in the whole game, Synchro Switch's demand soared during the final days of Master Rule 3. The new Master Rule was announced, and the player base would slowly learn about link summoning and the extra monster zone mechanic. Since you would need to special summon extra deck monsters to either the extra monster zone or zones a link monster pointed to, people looked for cards that could potentially free up your extra monster zone. It's important to say that this card actually received an errata after Master Rule 4, as it used to not say horizontal in its card text, so it was thought of as one of the best ways to free up your extra monster zone to allow you to keep playing. This was not the only card to get hyped up due to zone shenanigans, since other zone manipulating cards that were just pack fillers before came into the spotlight, like a Ground Collapse, which people thought you could use to block the extra monster zone. But of course, as more information came to light and all cards that mentioned zones were errated, Synchro Switch went back to its obscurity. This wasn't the first or last time cards got hyped due to a misunderstanding like this. Around the same era, there was also a rumor that Konami would increase the life point starting value to 16,000 to slow the game down, leading to buyouts of the card Ancient Leaf, since it's Pot of Greed if your life points are over 9,000. Funnily enough, Synchro Switch became relevant again in 2022 with the release of the Valence archetype, a series of pendulum monsters which all get their effects off when they change zones. Their most recent piece of support in the OCG can even search Synchro Switch itself from the deck. And coming in at number 2, we have Sea Monster Theseus. This is a level 5 tuner fusion monster with the shortest card text in Yu-Gi-Oh! 2 tuners, its summoning requirement. This card was another one hyped by Konami itself, ages before its set came out. This TCG exclusive card was said to be the strongest card of 2017. To put things in context, 2017 was the year when Zodiacs came out, who were the centerpiece of countless formats until their good XCs were all banned. This was also when the True Dracos were released, another archetype which saw lots of play for years, including their boss monsters Masterpiece, which is still banned to this day. Among these two, and countless other titans in the meta, including other cards such as Pre-Errata Firewall Dragon and Ash Blossom, this non-effect monster was supposed to be the strongest monster of that year. Now, Konami's reasoning was that since Elder Entity Norden was now banned, this card would take its place as the instant fusion target of choice. Norden was the reason why instant fusion saw play in pretty much every deck back in the day, since it was one of the easiest ways to spam materials on the field, and it was even summoned using the usual way of fusion substitute in Zodiac decks due to how strong it was. In the article released to hype this card up to the player base, they talked about how you could use it to go into synchros for decks that generally couldn't. Being able to suddenly make something like Black Rose Dragon or Cypher Lord Omega in decks that normally couldn't were decent plays at the time, but nothing that would shake up the meta like the previously mentioned cards. The issue with Theseus is how much extra deck investment it took up to actually do anything, while also requiring you to hard draw instant fusion and already have bodies on the field in order to make use of it. Of course, there was massive disappointment for the player base who were expecting a TCG exclusive that broke the game once again. At the very least, this card actually got better with time, since Christian Hockey Fibrax gives you a really nice payout for having a tuner body on the field. And despite instant fusion being limited, you now have a higher chance of being able to access him due to the release of Retort Fusion. Though none of that changes how much of a disappointment this card when it was revealed. And finally, at number 1, to no one's surprise, we have the Noble Knights. The Noble Knights are an archetype comprised mostly of warrior monsters and their weapons, with the Noble Arms sub-archetype. They first came out during the Xyz era, being released in small batches with every coming set, starting out with the vanilla with Noble Knight Artorias. These TCG exclusive cards hogged lots of high rarity spots in older sets, much to the dismay of whoever bought them. On the third or so wave of support, the player base could already tell the whole archetype wasn't going to amount much to anything, having lots of their cards being based on some of the worst mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh! With Geminis and equip spells. When the first piece of support came out, the strategy couldn't lift a candle against the meta strategies at the time in Mermails and Fire Fists. The deck's main play was to try to summon out their Xyz monster with a bunch of equip spells to protect it, something which wasn't very good in the first place, and it couldn't even do it consistently. For a couple of years, accompanying every new Noble Knight card release, there would be a Konami article calling it the new meta contender. This kept going all the way until the Duelist Alliance era, where they would infamously say a Noble Knight with a bunch of equip spells was the best out in the meta to shut all construct. The cards weren't completely hopeless, and some of the later pieces of support were even quite decent, earning this deck a couple of tops throughout the years, but it was not nearly the game breaker as Konami's fanfare would let you on. This subpar archetype got countless pieces of support, its own box set, and even its own exclusive rarity at some point in Platinum Rare. It was a shame how mediocre it was, due to how much it cost and how gorgeous some of the artwork was. But at least this archetype made up for it with the cards it got years later, deep in the Link era. Isolde, Two Tails of Noble Knights broke the meta with Gokis at release as an amazing tool for Warrior Link spam. She didn't really have anything to do with the main deck Noble Knights, but because of it needing equipped spells to go to the graveyard to use its second effect, it led to some Noble Arms cards seeing play as Isolde Garnets. Later on, Infernobles, another sub-archetype of the Noble Knights, would eventually become a tier 1 strategy for a while. But even if they did make a good new support eventually, that doesn't change how much of a disappointment the original Noble Knights were at first, especially since the Infernobles don't really use any of the support from the early Noble Knights. So, Noble Knights are still mocked to this day as the most overhyped series of cards ever printed in Yu-Gi-Oh! In this video, we'll go over cards which no one expected to be good when they first came out, but ended up seeing lots of play. And at number 10, we have Cup of Ace. This card has the effect where you can flip a coin, and if you get heads, you draw 2 cards. But if you get tails, your opponent draws 2 cards. So basically, it's a gamble card where you go +1 on the good effect, and -3 on the bad effect, so no one really used it because that negative effect is really bad. And that's how it would continue to be, a card no one used, but in Duel Links. This card is good enough to be on the semi-limited list, because the whole meta in Duel Links is just so different, with the lower life points, the lower opening hand. Getting off the heads effect of a single Cup of Ace was sometimes enough to win you the duel with certain burn decks. And so, a card that could instantly win you the game if you simply got lucky on your first turn was kind of a problem, so Konami had to put it on the semi-limited list to really control the luck-based nature of burn decks, as well as limiting a whole bunch of other cards that let you win on your first turn. And even then, Cup of Ace still gets played, as there's a skill in the game that allows your first 3 coin tosses to always be heads, which just turns Cup of Ace into a pot of greed in that deck. And at number 9, we have Metaverse. This is a trap card with an effect to search out a field spell card from your deck, or activate it straight from your deck. Now, when this card first came out, people thought it was just a worse terraforming, a spell card which allows you to search out any field spell from your deck. Basically, because terraforming exists, anything that had an effect to search out a field spell card had to be better than terraforming for decks to even consider playing it. And Metaverse was just a worse terraforming, as having to set a trap card and then wait a turn to activate it in order to search out another card is just worse than getting to activate a spell card directly from your hand for no cost. And then something happened to the game. 2 cards were released afterwards that retroactively made Metaverse just as good as terraforming, if not better in certain situations. One of them, called Trap Trick, which is a trap card that allows you to search out any normal trap card from your deck and then activate it that turn, and a field spell card called Mystic Mine. A field spell with such a good lockdown effect that it basically counters nearly all of the top meta decks by itself. But it has a restriction where it destroys itself based on the number of monsters on the field. So, you couldn't really activate Mystic Mine during your first turn and then pass to your opponent in order to lock him out of monster effects, without Mystic Mine destroying itself. But with Metaverse, that allowed you to activate it directly from your deck during your opponent's turn, which is better than terraforming in that kind of deck. And Mystic Mine was so good with Metaverse, and Trap Trick made it so easy to search out Metaverse, that they just straight up limited Metaverse to 1. They also limited terraforming to 1 as well at the same time, just to show that terraforming was still very powerful as well. It's just when Metaverse first came out, no one really expected it to outperform terraforming in any deck. Although, even then, the card was still a straight up search anything from your deck, so it was still kind of good. That's why it's only the number 9 spot on this list. And at number 8, we have the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode. Now, before this card came out, the Egyptian god cards were kind of a joke in the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh community, as they're a very, very popular archetype, one that was completely broken in the anime, which is not very good in the actual game. Despite that fact, they still remained very popular in the actual game, on the more casual side of Yu-Gi-Oh anyway. So, when they released new support for the Winged Dragon of Ra, in the form of giving him a Sphere mode as well as a Phoenix mode, to better showcase its anime effects, people didn't really pay it too much mind. And in fact, some people just thought it was a worse kaiju, since it requires 3 monsters instead of 1. Because what this card does is you contribute 3 monsters from either player's side of the field in order to summon this card. And then you contribute this card to special summon a Winged Dragon of Ra from your deck with 4,000 attack and defense. And this card is nowadays one of the most played side deck cards, because the ability to tribute 3 of your opponent's monsters is actually super good in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, where the current meta is all about setting up a board of monsters who can negate anything you want to do. Because if you tribute the monsters for Sphere mode, they can't respond to that tribute with a negate. They just lose their monsters, and then get a 0 attack monster in return. And since it can tribute 3 monsters, it can more readily get rid of a whole bunch of hard to get rid of monsters at once, whereas kaijus can only get rid of 1 at a time. And at number 7, we have Brilliant Fusion. This card has the effect where you can use materials from your deck to fusion summon a Gem Knight fusion monster, but that card will have 0 attack and defense. Now, this card was played so much in so many different decks that the most used card with Brilliant Fusion, Gem Knight Garnet, is now the card known for having a dead card in your hand. And in fact, if you have a dead card in your hand and you refer to it as a Garnet, people will know what you mean because of how prevalent Brilliant Fusion was, before it got limited to 1. And funny enough, when this card first came out, no one was really using it, because the best way to use Brilliant Fusion is to bring out Gem Knight Seraphinite, and sending Gem Knight Garnet plus 1 light monster from your deck to the graveyard. And in doing this, you gain a monster on the field, a double summon due to Seraphinite's effect, and a selective mill of a light monster to the graveyard, of which there are a lot of great targets. So this is so much value from this one little play, and that's why it saw so much play. But no one really used it until I think a Super Quantal Mech King Great Magnus deck used Brilliant Fusion Engine in order to turbo out Great Magnus. And since this one card, not part of the Super Quantal archetype, was the reason that archetype was able to be successful for that tournament, that really got people to notice how good this card was. And then all of a sudden, everybody was using it, to the point where it got limited for being too useful. And at number 6, we have Solemn Judgment. Funny enough, Solemn Judgment came out in one of the earliest sets of the game, and rarely saw play, despite the fact that it's considered one of the strongest trap cards nowadays, and spent years on the ban list. Because what it does is it allows you to pay half your life points to negate the summon of any monster, or negate any spell or trap card effect. It's basically pay half your life points to negate one of anything, which is a really good effect, as a single negate can completely disrupt an opponent's strategy and win you the game. But back when this card first came out, rarely anyone was using it. And that's kind of because the game back then was just a lot slower, where even if you could negate one key part of your opponent's strategy, it was difficult to get enough monsters on board to OTK your opponent consistently, whereas basically any deck can do that easily nowadays. So you couldn't really take advantage of the negate as easily as you can today. Kind of. This card is a point of contention in the GOAT format community, as the GOAT format only uses old cards from that one format in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! And since Solemn Judgment existed back then, people played in the GOAT format. But no one was playing Solemn Judgment in the actual days of the GOAT format. It's kind of like using future knowledge of a card being good in an old game, so it can be seen as kind of an advantage. Now, that doesn't really matter. Solemn Judgment is still a really good card even today in the current meta, and the reason it doesn't see very much play is just because many decks don't use trap cards, because they'd rather have that card in their hand be something that could extend combo plays, than setting something like Solemn Judgment. Although I should mention it does absolutely see play, just, not in like every deck. And at number 5, we have Mudragon of the Swamp. Now, this is a level 4 fusion monster who has an effect to help your monsters become untargetable to card effects. It's a neat effect, but that's not why people play this card. The reason this card sees play is because of its fusion materials. This card requires any 2 monsters with the same attribute but different types, which is really good when comboed with a card like Super Polymerization, a card that lets you use your opponent's monsters as fusion materials, and that's recently come off the ban list completely, and is an excellent way for people to get rid of problem cards on their opponent's side of the board, because Super Polymerization is spell speed 4, so they can't negate it. And Mudragon of the Swamp is just a really good card to use with Super Polymerization, as it allows you to have a wide range of different monsters you might come across. And that's the true value of this card. Literally, it's combo potential with Super Polymerization, and that's it. If they banned Super Polymerization again, then no one's going to use this card. But because Super Poly is in the game, and because it's so good against the current meta, people are playing this card, and it's entirely dependent on the status of Super Poly. And at number 4, we have Mass Driver. This is a continuous spell card with the effect to tribute 1 monster on your side of the field to inflict 400 points of burn damage to your opponent. When this card first came out, people thought this card was terrible, as getting rid of one of your monsters for only 400 points of damage was not at all worth the trade-off. 400 points of damage is basically just a double Sparks, a card infamous for being terrible. And Mass Driver is currently banned, and I can't see it ever coming off the ban list. And here's why this card was considered bad when it came out, and considered so good today. And that's entirely just because of the evolution of the speed of the game. Back in the day, when this card first came out, it was incredibly difficult to special summon 1 monster during your turn. The meta was to tribute a Summon Skull, and then use that to beat over your opponent's monsters. In a slow meta like that, there is no way to take advantage of Mass Driver. It wasn't until Substitoad came out, along with Swap Frog and Ronin Totem, that decks finally got to the point where they could special summon a ton of monsters in 1 turn, which worked really well with a card that can tribute them for burn damage that had no once per turn restriction on it. So, in order to FDK your opponent with Mass Driver, you just needed to use its effect 20 times. And special summoning 20 cards during your first turn, in the old school days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, is just not happening. But a Frog deck with Substitoad can easily and consistently special summon 20 monsters in 1 turn. Of course, Substitoad is banned, and they usually get rid of loops that allow you to special summon an infinite amount of times during your turn. And there's even cards like Kinetic Soldier still legal in the game that can do what Mass Driver does, only on a monster effect. But those are kind of balanced by the fact that you need to get that monster on the field, whereas Mass Driver is a continuous spell card, so it's much easier to use for the same effect. And even in the OCG, all of the Kinetic Soldier-like cards are banned anyway, because being able to tribute an unlimited amount of times during your turn for burn damage just opens up too much potential for decks that can win on your first turn. And at number 3, we have Super Rejuvenation. This card's kind of like Mass Driver, in that it existed in the game for a long time, and no one ever used it, until the Dragon Rulers came out. And Super Rejuvenation has an effect, where you can draw cards equal to the number of Dragon-type monsters you discarded or tributed during the end phase. And since Dragon Rulers are all about discarding a crap ton of Dragon monsters from your hand, Super Rejuvenation was basically turning into a Spellbook of Judgment for Dragon Ruler decks. And Spellbook of Judgment is one of the most broken cards of all time. So they banned Super Rejuvenation for allowing you to go +6 during your end phase, or even more sometimes, as you could go above the hand size limit and be completely fine with discarding your extra cards to the graveyard, as Dragon Rulers are all about using the cards in your graveyard as a resource anyway. But then they banned all the Dragon Rulers, and without the Dragon Rulers in the game, Super Rejuvenation isn't really that bad. It's really only that one archetype that can take advantage of it to the degree that allows you to go +6 during the end phase consistently. And that's why this card is unlimited in the OCG, where they literally only have one Dragon Ruler unbanned, and limited to one. Because it's not that big of a deal outside of Dragon Ruler decks, but it still gets a high spot on this list, because in Dragon Ruler decks, this card is incredibly broken. And at number 2, we have Ancient Fairy Dragon. This was a synchro monster that existed for a really long time, and was one of the 5 main dragon synchro monsters from the 5Ds anime, and was always considered the worst of the bunch, because what it does is it allows you to destroy the field spell cards, and then add another field spell card from your deck to your hand, as well as gain 1000 life points. And it also has an effect that allows you to special summon a level 4 or lower monster from your hand, at the cost of giving up your battle phase. Giving up your battle phase is a pretty hefty cost for special summoning a low level monster from your hand. So most people never use that first effect because it was kind of bad. Back then. And also back then, field spell cards weren't very good, and most archetypes had their weakest card of their archetype being their field spell card, as it would usually just give them an attack boost or something else mediocre. So being able to destroy them and then search out another one just wasn't a big deal. But then, kind of like Mass Driver, the meta of the game shifted. Konami started printing field spell cards that were actually the best card of the archetype, as many of them allowed you to go +1 when activating them, or gained effects if they were destroyed. And this card allowed you to special summon a monster from your hand, which is super valuable in combo decks. So the combination of both of these effects on an extra deck monster, which means you don't have to search it out from your main deck and can go into it as long as you're able to go into a level 7 synchro monster, made this card incredibly good, and broken in certain decks that could search off their field spell cards being destroyed, or could just go +1 when they were activated. And it got to the point where some decks could win on their first turn with a single card from their hand, basically because Ancient Fairy Dragon existed, and allowed them to pull off incredible combos. And that's why Ancient Fairy Dragon got banned. It's just too good of a combo extender now. Which is ironic because none of the other 5 main dragon synchro monsters from the 5Ds anime are on the ban list in any way, shape, or form. So it went from being the worst of the bunch to the most broken of the bunch. And at number 1, we have Grinder Golem. Now, just like a lot of other cards on this list, this card existed in the game for a long time and never saw any play, and in fact was thought of as kind of a joke card because its effect was kind of bad. Because what this card does is, at the cost of your normal summon, you can special summon this 3k beater from your hand to your opponent's side of the field, and in exchange, you get 2 tokens with 0 attack in attack position. So basically, you were giving your opponent a strong monster, losing your normal summon for the turn, all for 2 tokens with no stats that were forced into attack position. So this card was almost never played, and only really saw success in gimmicky Inferno Tempest builds. Although I don't know if you can really call those successful decks. But then, Link monsters were added to the game, and Link monsters allow you to bring out extra deck monsters with tokens. And there were a few Link monsters that could return Grinder Golem to your hand from your opponent's side of the field. And since Grinder Golem only locks you out of your normal summon for the turn, not from special summons, a single Grinder Golem could be special summoned from your hand many times to grant you a Link 4 monster easily, while also getting the Grinder Golem back in your hand. So basically, without losing any advantage and only giving up your normal summon for that turn. And Grinder Golem was so good, it was basically a staple card in every single meta deck that could use Link monsters, because there is almost no reason not to play Grinder Golem with how much advantage this one card could give you. And then the card eventually got limited to 1, and everyone was still playing it in every single deck. And then the card eventually just got banned for still being too good. Grinder Golem is like the poster boy for this list, a card that was basically thought of as a joke, becoming one of the most played staple cards in the game overnight, because it just happened to interact very well with the new summoning mechanic. In this video, we'll go over 10 tech cards which absolutely no one uses that actually have some pretty good effects. And when I say nobody uses it, I mean they do sometimes see competitive play, but just not a lot or not recently. And at number 10, we have Ghost Mourner and Moonlight Chill. This card has the effect that allows you to negate the effect of a monster on the field after it's been special summoned, and also if that face-up card leaves the field this turn, the controller takes damage equal to its attack. So basically it's like Effect Veiler or an Infinite Impermanence, except it also deals a little bit of burn damage, and has the stats of the Ghost Sisters, where it's a level 3 tutor so it has some niche uses with Crystron Halki Fibrax. And the reason this card doesn't see very much play is because it's a slightly more restrictive to use infinite impermanence or effect veiler, and also has a hard once per turn, which the previous two cards lack. So if all you need is a hand trap that negates your opponent's card effects, usually you're set with just effect veiler or infinite impermanence, as they can target any effect monster while not having once per turns on their effects. Which means if you have 3 copies of infinite impermanence in your hand, you can use all 3 copies of them in hand during your opponent's turn. But if you have 3 copies of Ghost Mourner and Moonlight Chill, you'll only be able to use a single copy. So the effect is actually pretty good, as most people will use infinite impermanence on a monster of a special summon from the extra deck anyway. And if your opponent continues their combos in order to get rid of the card in the field, they'll take extra damage. So it's a perfectly viable tech option, even if it's not as live as the other two, and absolutely does see competitive play occasionally. And at number 9, we have Gizmek Kaku, the Supreme Shining Sky stack. This card has the effect in the hand where if there's a monster in the extra monster zone, you can special summon this card from your hand, and it has another effect where it can absorb a monster in the extra monster zone, and if it destroys a monster by battle, you can special summon a monster that's currently being absorbed by the card. It is a pretty decent stat line at 2750, so with most decks ending with a monster in their extra monster zone, this card is almost always live, and it has a really good for removal and a chance to just special summon the card it removes. This card kind of reminds me of Dino Wrestler Pancratops in its usefulness, except the effect is purely limited to monsters in the extra monster zone, which is most likely only going to be a single target. But its effect is not spell speed 2, so it can't avoid disruption like Pancratops can. So, because it can't just choose anything your opponent controls, it's limited enough where it doesn't see widespread play, but has a technically really good effect, which is also pretty generic. And at number 8, we have Mistaken Arrest. This is a quick play spell card which has the effect where cards cannot be added from either player's main deck to the hand except by drawing them until the end of your next turn after this card resolves. So since it's a quick play spell card, you can actually chain it in response to your opponent activating something that searches from the deck, like Elemental Hero Stratos for example. Then it will stop the card from searching and stop them from searching for the rest of the turn, which sadly does carry over to your turn as well. It makes it so you can't do any searching when your turn rolls around. So Mistaken Arrest is basically a longer lasting version of Drone Lockbird, except it has the benefits where it's able to stop a search from happening in the first place, rather than stopping searches from happening after a search has already been performed, which is how Drone Lockbird activates. Although Drone Lockbird has the advantage where it's a hand trap, so you can use it during your opponent's first turn, whereas Mistaken Arrest can't. Although if you're going first, or if you just really don't want to play any monster cards in your deck at all, Mistaken Arrest is a perfectly fine alternative to Drone Lockbird, assuming you're fine being locked out of searching during your turn as well, which some decks can accommodate. And at number 7, we have Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. This card has the effect where if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, you can discard this card from your hand in order to reveal one monster in your extra deck, to then banish all copies of that card from your opponent's extra deck with the same name. So if you just stack your extra deck with a whole bunch of very common boss monsters, you can completely stop your opponent's end goal, where they have to use their second best cards, or just lose in some cases if you banish the card their entire deck revolves around, like ABC Dragon Buster. And this card absolutely did see some competitive play. It just hasn't seen very much competitive play recently, because most meta decks go into a wide variety of boss monsters, not really a specific one. And because this card kind of falls into the category of just not being played right now, it's somewhat low on this list, kind of like all the other ones I've talked about so far. And at number 6, we have Shared Ride. This card has the effect where after you use it, each time your opponent adds a card from their deck or graveyard to their hand except by drawing, you get to draw one card. So it's kind of like a spell card version of Maxi, except one that only triggers on searches rather than special summons. And generally, most decks special summon a lot more than they search, but copious amounts of searching is kind of a requirement of a deck being a meta deck, and since you can just chain it in response to your opponent already performing any search, you'll always go at least card neutral with it, even if you only draw a single card. It seems like all the cards that have Sangan in their artwork, like this one in Mistaken Arrest, kind of just have effects that are similar to popular hand traps, while being slightly weaker than them. And the fact that they're quick play spell cards inherently nerfs them compared to their hand trap counterparts. In addition to just not being as strong as their hand trap counterparts. As generally, the reason hand traps are really good is because you can use them during your opponent's first turn. That way you can stop your opponent from establishing an unbeatable board, rather than trying to react to it. And at number 5, we have Royal Decree. This card has the effect that where it's face up on the field, it straight up negates the effects of all other trap effects on the field. So, it's a trap card that stops all other trap cards, and is basically the trap card version of Jinzo, the card that has seen competitive play ever since it came out in 2002. And it's pretty obvious why. It's one card that shuts down a third of the cards in the game. However, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, actual trap cards aren't really played very much, and the best way to stop trap cards is usually to just use Red Reboot. Red Reboot can negate the effects of trap cards for only a single turn. However, it's spell speed 3 and can be activated from the hand. And that hand trap status means you don't need to set it like Royal Decree for a turn in order to flip it face up on your next turn in order to gain the benefits of locking out your opponent's trap cards. Plus, Royal Decree has counterplay to it, where your opponent can stop it with just any form of removal. Red Reboot is much harder to stop though, because of that spell speed 3 nature, and you don't need to wait a turn in order to make sure the card is live. In fact, Red Reboot is so good at stopping trap cards that it's currently limited on the ban list, whereas Royal Decree is completely unlimited at 3 copies. And Royal Decree does have a long history of competitive play in the side deck as a tech option, which shouldn't surprise you based on what this list is about. In fact, the card was even semi-limited for 4 formats back in 2007 through 2008, and then one more time in 2010. Although it's definitely in the category of fallen out of favor recently, mainly because trap cards on a whole aren't as widely played, and it requires just a tiny bit too much setup, where actually it's kind of better to just use a Denko Sekka instead, for example. And at number 4, we have Retaliating Sea. This card has the effect where, if your opponent activates a spell card that has an effect which can special summon a monster, you can then special summon this card from your hand. And it has an additional effect where, if it's special summoned by its first effect, it gains a Floodgate effect where any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. So a hand trap version of Macrocosmos. In addition to this card's effect on the field, where if it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you get to add an insect-type monster from your deck to your hand, just as long as it's earth and has 1500 or less attack. Now, its Floodgate effect is actually kind of limiting in how it can actually be applied, because not a lot of decks use spell cards to special summon pretty heavily. Although there are some archetypes which almost exclusively special summon through spell cards, and those are generally fusion archetypes, where pretty much all fusion spell cards are spell cards. So it's an excellent option to use against a fusion-heavy deck. In addition to its floating effect not being once per turn, doesn't miss timing and activates no matter how it's sent from the field to the graveyard. Since Maxi is currently banned, there isn't a super good generic card you can search out, but I do use this card a lot in Duel Links specifically because of that effect in order to search out Resonance Insect, which is another insect-type monster which does not have a once per turn on any of its floating effects that can search or send cards to the graveyard. If they ever create a really strong insect-type archetype in the future, you can bet they're going to be using Resonant Insects and Retaliating Sea to some advantage. And at number 3, we have Witch's Strike. This is a trap card which can only be activated if your opponent negates the activation or effect of a card, or if they negate the normal or special summon of a monster. In which case you get to destroy all cards your opponent controls and in their hand. And since the name of the game in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is to negate, it seems like this card would always be live and provide you amazing advantage because it just destroys your opponent's entire hand. And that is 100% correct. The card is potentially incredibly good. However, it's a trap card, which requires you to set it first and wait for your opponent to negate an effect before it gets destroyed on your side of the field. If the effect was simply a quick play spell card or a hand trap, it would be kind of broken. The way they rated the power level of this card is by attaching it to a trap card, which slows it down just enough that it's just a really neat tech option, but doesn't see very much competitive play. Because if you're able to resolve the card a single time, the amount of advantage it nets you can kind of win you the game. However, your opponent can just negate the effect of Witch's Strike in order to stop that from happening, which is kind of ironic considering the activation requirement of the card. And at number 2, we have the Engraver of the Mark. This is a card which has the effect where, if your opponent activates an effect which requires them to declare exactly one card name, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to declare another name, which then becomes the name they declared for that card's effect. And it also has an effect on the field where it can destroy one of your opponent's monsters after a turn. Now, this card falls under the category of having an incredibly niche counter effect, but it's potentially pretty good. There have been some cards in the meta which required you to declare exactly one card name, and I have seen competitive play, like Mind Crush or Prohibition. Although those cards haven't really seen competitive play recently, and they were never really widespread enough where it was worth running a card like Engraver of the Mark in order to circumvent their effects. So unless Konami puts out a new, really strong card which declares exactly one card name, it's probably going to stay a niche card that no one uses, but has the potential to be very useful. And at number 1, we have Sales Pitch. This card can only be activated if your opponent adds a card from their deck to their hand, except by drawing, in which case you get to add any card from your deck to your hand, although you can't activate the card for the rest of the turn. So, Sales Pitch basically just lets you search out any card in the game without any restrictions, and that's almost useful to literally every deck. There isn't really a deck that doesn't benefit from being able to search out any card. And the activation requirement is the same as Mistaken Arrest or Shared Ride, i.e. your opponent just adding cards from their deck to their hand outside of drawing, which means you're pretty much going to have the card live in any normal duel. So why does nobody use Sales Pitch if its effect is obviously super good? Well, the same reason as Witch's Strike or Royal Decree, because it's a trap card that needs to be set for a turn first. And that's pretty much it. I bet there will be some decks which can make use of it in the future because the effect is just really good and it's not that hard at all to activate. It does have the restriction where you can't use the card you add to your hand during the turn, which definitely limits it a lot. If you could use the card, then you could use it to search out a hand trap during your opponent's turn in order to stop your opponent from doing whatever they're doing during their turn. Although since you can't, you're basically just limited to searching out a card that'd be really useful during your next turn. But being able to search out any card is still really good even under those restrictions, so it might see some competitive play in the future, who knows? And it's definitely one of the best tech cards that no one's currently using. In this video, we'll go over some card effects that are pretty unconventional about how they do things, and generally just don't have other cards in the game with similar effects to them. And at number 10, we have Mischief of the Time Goddess. This is a card which has an effect that's so different from how other cards and effects work in the game that they can't even program it into Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro. Although the card itself is not super weird. Basically what it does is you can activate this card at the end of your battle phase, as long as you only control Valkyrie monsters, and then you get to skip to the start of the battle phase of your next turn. Now, since you skip to the start of the battle phase of your next turn, that causes all kinds of ruling nightmares about how cards and effects are supposed to resolve, because this card is part of the Valkyrie archetype, and they have a card called Ride of the Valkyries, which allows you to special summon a whole bunch of monsters from your hand, but during the end phase you have to shuffle all of the monsters you control back into your deck. This same card also has a graveyard effect that lets you search out Mischief of the Time Goddess. So the intended synergy is you use Ride of the Valkyries to bring out 3 Valkyrie monsters, and then use Mischief of the Time Goddess in order to skip this card's negative effect, since you just skip to the end phase of the turn, and then immediately go to your next turn. Although you're skipping everything, this also skips all kinds of effects that would activate similar to Ride of the Valkyries, and it also skips your draw phase, and essentially just allows you to conduct your battle phase twice, while also letting you skip end of turn negative effects, or standby phase negative effects, or any other maintenance cost that happens during phases that's not just the battle phase. It's a pretty unique effect no other card in the game does, and I thought it would be an excellent one to start off this list. And at number 9, we have Xyz Extreme. This is a card which has an effect where if an Xyz monster you control is destroyed by battle, you can pay life points to force you and your opponent to reveal one Xyz monster from your respective extra decks, as long as that Xyz monster has a lower rank than the monster that was destroyed. And then whoever reveals a monster with lower attack will take effect damage equal to the difference between the two monsters. But if your opponent doesn't reveal a monster, then you get to inflict damage to your opponent equal to all of the attack of your revealed monster. So what's unique about this card is that you and your opponent are revealing one specific type of low rank card from your extra deck in order to inflict burn damage after a specific trigger on the field happens. This effect is one of a kind, even if the end result is basically just inflict burn damage to your opponent. And at number 8, we have Die Dance. This card allows you to choose one of your opponent's monster zones, where, if your opponent would summon a card, they must summon it to the zone that you selected. And this effect lasts until your opponent summons a monster there, so it has the potential to last for multiple turns if your opponent just doesn't bring out any monsters to their main monster zones, with this card having its limited downside in order to avoid ruling confusions, where it can only be used once per duel. Since if you use multiple copies of this card, you could select 2 zones where they can only summon a monster there, which might cause an infinite loop where they weren't allowed to summon a monster at all. Now, this card isn't super good, There are ways you can use it in order to force your opponent to summon a monster to a link zone you point to, which has a negative effect, like one of the topologic link monsters. But it's a little bit too niche to see any actual play, which is kind of the case for most of these cards. And at number 7, we have Reverse Trap. This card has the effect where if a card or effect would increase or decrease the attack and defense of a monster, those effects instead do the opposite. So, for example, if you summon a monster like Flash Assailant, who loses 400 attack for each card in your hand, and you have 5 cards in your hand, normally its attack would go down to 0. However, if you've used Reverse Trap during that turn, it would instead gain 400 attack for each card in your hand, and its attack would go up to 4,000. Or if your opponent had a field spell card out which increased the attack of all their monsters, like a Legendary Ocean, for example, all of their water monsters would lose 200 attack and defense instead of gaining it. Now, this card has a whole bunch of rulings in place because of how confusing this effect can get for certain cards. Like if you use the effect of Light and Darkness Dragon, who has an effect where it loses 500 attack every time it negates a card effect on the field. With Reverse Trap, one would assume that he would instead gain 500 attack every time it negated the effect of a card, which would make it very strong. However, there exists a special ruling that states it can only happen once, even though the time limit on this card is until the end of your turn. So basically, if you can think of a way in order to break this card in order to make it very strong, chances are there is a specific ruling in place that says you can't do that. And there just exist some cards in the game which have special rulings that state they can't do certain things, which you just kind of have to memorize. And Reverse Trap is one of those cases, because it's a one-of-a-kind effect. And at number 6, we have Yugioh Invader. This card has the effect where it can only be summoned to the middle main monster zone. And you can, once per turn, move this card over to a zone as long as it's adjacent to the zone and it's unused. Now, when this card moves to another zone, it destroys all other cards in the same column as it, so all the cards above and below it. And every time your opponent summons a monster to their side of the field, this card will automatically move itself one space closer to them and then destroy all cards in its column. And you can proc this effect by special summoning monsters to your opponent's side of the field, with things like Give and Take, in order to navigate where you want this card to move during your opponent's turn. This card is really unique in that it just continuously moves to adjacent zones and then destroys all the cards in it. And you can manipulate how you move this card by giving your opponent monsters, or just forcing them to summon a monster into specific zones, like with Die Dance. Now, zone and column cards became a lot more commonplace with Link monsters, as pretty much the entire Mech Knight archetype is about zone-based mechanics, and there's even a card called Volt Tester, who can destroy a whole bunch of cards based on what Link monsters are pointing to, but Yugioh is unique in that it constantly moves during your opponent's turn based on which zones they summon monsters to. And at number 5, we have Transmission Gear, the only card in the game which requires you to play rock, paper, scissors in order to resolve its effect. And this card has the effect where, during the damage calculation, if your monster battles an opponent's monster, you and your opponent play a game of rock, paper, scissors, and whoever loses the game has to banish their monster they control face down. So it's kind of like the effect of Eater of Millions, where you can banish a monster you're battling face down. But you also have to be pretty good at rock, paper, scissors in order to resolve this effect. And some tips on rock, paper, scissors? Psychologically speaking, people are more willing to throw rock in stressful situations, so you have an advantage if you pick paper, as you'll either win or tie against other people who know this little fact. And at number 4, we have Spirit Elimination. This card has the effect that when monsters in your graveyard are removed from play, you can remove monsters from your side of the field from play as a substitute. And it also goes on to say that monsters removed from play with this effect stay removed from play, even after the end of this turn when this effect no longer applies, which is really redundant and kinda shows the age of this card with how old it is with its wording. So the intended use of this card would be to banish cards from your side of the field instead of your graveyard as the cost to summon a monster like Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, since you need to banish one light and dark monster from your graveyard in order to special summon it from your hand. But it also causes all kinds of confusing ruling nightmares, like how you can use it if Necro Valley is on the field, which normally prevents you from moving cards from your graveyard somewhere else, or how you need to have monsters in your graveyard in order to be able to banish ones from your side of the field, and how does it interact when you banish cards from your opponent's graveyard? Basically, this card was so difficult to program that it was banned from Yu-Gi-Oh! Online, when that was still around before 2012, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Online would release all the cards that were released. They didn't have their own separate release schedule like Duel Links does. They would just release cards like a year after they came out in the regular TCG. And because of this, they had their own little separate ban list. And Spirit Elimination was on that ban list because they couldn't code it properly. But they had to add it to the game anyway. And at number 3, we have Magical Hats. This is the only card in the game which can special summon spell and trap cards from your deck as monster cards, and gives them attack and defense while they're face down monsters. Normally, when a token is summoned, they can't exist face down, and they just get brought out into being from outside of the game, so you can use anything you want as a token. But Magical Hats was made in the days before they just used tokens by default for effects like these. Tokens existed in the early days of the game, but this was still kind of around when tokens were incredibly rare. And this card experimented with using spell and trap cards as tokens, which they never did again because of how this card kind of became incredibly useful because of its ability to summon spell or trap cards to the field. Now, what this card's actual effect is during your opponent's battle phase, if you control a monster, you can then choose any 2 spell or trap cards from your deck and set them on your field face down as normal monsters with 0 attack and defense. Then you shuffle your monster plus these 2 cards around. The idea was that your opponent would attack one of the spell or trap cards as a bait to potentially save your monster from getting destroyed. Because at the end of the battle phase, the 2 cards are destroyed anyway, and they can't remain on the field except during that one battle phase. Now, there are a couple of spell or trap cards which have floating effects when they're destroyed by card effects, and Magical Hats will activate those effects when they're destroyed on the field by its effect, or by battle as long as they don't miss the timing, or if they have wording where they don't specifically need to be destroyed by an effect. So if you set Gear Town, for example, you'll be able to use its effect to special summon a monster from your deck. And since these cards are treated as monsters, you can also activate a card like Sound the Retreat, in order to add those 2 spell or trap cards to your hand. And if you have ways to tribute monsters during the battle phase, like with our rivals, the spell or trap cards can be used for that. There's a reason they haven't printed other cards with an effect like Magical Hats. And if it wasn't for the fact that Magical Hats was a slow battle trap, it would probably see more play for how many ways you can abuse its effect. And at number 2, we have an unfortunate report. This card's only effect is that your opponent can conduct their next battle phase twice. And this is the only card in the game that allows your opponent to conduct their battle phase 2 times in one turn, with the other card in the game with a similar effect being Weather Report, which allows you to conduct your battle phase twice if you pull off a very convoluted and incredibly specific activation requirement. Now, because of an unfortunate report and Weather Report, cards which talk about gaining extra attacks during the battle phase have to specify that they gain an extra attack during each battle phase. So if you've ever wondered why cards like the Tripper Mercury, for example, who can attack twice, specifies it can attack twice during each battle phase, it's literally because of these 2 cards and nothing else. So because this one weird effect exists that no one uses because it's only on really bad cards, every card which indicates extra attacks during the battle phase have to specify that it works during each battle phase, and I just find that hilarious. And at number 1, we have Time Magic Hammer, the only card which requires you to know basic algebra in order to resolve its effect. Now, this is a card which can only be brought out with the Claw of Hermo spell card, in which you send a spellcaster type monster from your hand or field to the graveyard, which acts as a 1-card fusion to bring this card out, where it then immediately needs to equip itself to a face-up monster on the field. And this card has the effect that if it battles a monster, the opponent's monster will be banished until the standby phase of the nth turn after this effect is activated, with n equal to the result of the dice roll. So you have to roll a dice, and if the result is 6, then the opponent's monster is banished until the 6th standby phase. And this is the only card in the game which has an effect which refers to the nth. Now, there are other cards in the game where you have to do a little bit of math in order to determine their effects, like basically all of the monsters with question mark for attack, and there's also lots of monsters which gain stuff times the number of other things, like Grenmaju, who's a good example of both of these things, as it has a question mark for attack and defense, and its attack and defense is determined by the amount of banished cards times 400. Although, with the wording and effect of Time Magic Hammer, they kind of needed to substitute a simple math formula in order to determine its unique effect, of banishing a card for a random amount of time determined by a dice roll. And this is why this card gets number 1 on this list. It's a card which requires you to do basic math every time you want to resolve its effect. Early Yu-Gi-Oh! Had a whole bunch of really weird card texts, as a lot of cards were trying to explain mechanics of the game in their card text in addition to what the cards actually did. So in this list, we'll be going over cards which have some really weird wording for their rulings or just used to do something completely different. And at number 10, we have Lord of D. The original text of this card used to read, all dragon-type monsters are not affected by magic cards, trap cards, or other effects while this card is face up on the field. Which means the original version of this card used to grant all of your dragon monsters protection from basically all card effects, which was actually pretty powerful. They quickly errated the card though, in order to change it to the wording of, all dragon-type monsters cannot be targeted by magic cards, trap cards, or other effects that specifically designate a target while this card's face up on the field. So it was basically changed from all dragons being unaffected by card effects to all dragons not being able to be targeted by card effects. Here's the thing though, early Yu-Gi-Oh! Rarely designated if a card targeted or not. If we take a look at the original Tribute to the Doomed, for example, its first card text simply says, discard one card from your hand to the graveyard to destroy one monster card on the field, regardless of its position. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, a card with this kind of card text would mean that the card does not target, since it doesn't specifically say that it does. So, it would be considered non-targeting removal. However, this card does target. In later erratas, it was changed that it selects the monster on the field, before eventually getting the card text where it says that it targets a monster on the field and destroys it. Or if we look at Raikou the Lightsworn Hunter, its original effect read that it can destroy one card on the field, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. However, it was intended for the card to target, so its later printing said that it would select and then eventually target. However, it was eventually errated to no longer target, which makes things even more confusing with what cards can and can't target. So because a lot of early cards which did target didn't actually say they targeted, Lord of D wasn't super useful until problem-solving card text was added many years later, where it's still kinda difficult to determine if a card can target or not. And at number 9, we have Monster Reborn. The original card text for this card reads, select one monster card from either your opponent's or your own graveyard and place it on your field under your control in attack or defense position face up. This is considered a special summon. That's a lot of text to say special summon one monster from either player's graveyard, which is essentially what the modern version of Monster Reborn looks like. The reason Monster Reborn had so much text to explain such a simple mechanic was mainly to remind players what the special summon mechanic was, as Monster Reborn was one of the only cards in the game at the time that could actually special summon a monster, and it was a pretty iconic card that a lot of people were going to use, so I guess it made sense to explain that you can put the monster in either attack or defense position face up. And at number 8, we have Dust Tornado. The original card text for this card reads, destroy one magic or trap card on your opponent's side of the field. You can then set one magic or trap card from your hand. This card can only be activated if it is a quick play magic card. Now, besides the fact that this card doesn't specify that it targets, and the fact that it refers to spell cards as magic cards before they change the name of them, what you may have noticed about this card is that last line of text on it, where it says, the card it sets can only be activated if it's a quick play magic card. You see, in the very early Yu-Gi-Oh!, quick play spell cards were usable the turn they were set, because they didn't have the ruling yet that basically treated them as trap cards. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, if you set a quick play spell card from your hand face down, you're not allowed to use it during the same turn that it's set face down. However, before they updated the rulings on this, you were able to activate any spell card the turn they were put on the field, no matter what kind of card they were, including quick play spell cards. Because currently, if you set a normal spell card face down, you can then activate it during the same turn if you want. And the same case is true for every other type of spell card, except for quick play spell cards, so it definitely made sense for the original quick play spells to work like all other spell cards do. Although this was probably changed because of Dust Tornado, where you could use it to destroy one of your opponent's back row cards, then you could set it MST from your hand during your opponent's turn in order to destroy another card, so you only had to have one face down card in the field instead of 2 in order to achieve 2 back row pops. And at number 7, we have Wall of Illusion. This is a card that a lot of old school players know very well, as it was included in one of the original structure decks in the very first set in the TCG, and was actually good, because of its ability to bounce cards upon being attacked while having a pretty high defense. And the original card text of this card read, the monster attacking this creature is returned to its owner's hand. Any damage resulting from the attack is calculated normally. Now, the wording on this probably doesn't seem that odd when compared to something as wordy as the original Monster Reborn. Although, did you see the mention of the word creature rather than monster? You see, there are 3 types of cards in the game, that being monster cards, spell cards, and trap cards, but there are no creature cards. So the original text of Wall of Illusion refers to itself as a type of card that didn't exist in the game, although it was pretty obvious to guess that it meant monsters, so I'm sure all of nobody was actually confused. However, it is kind of funny that it referred to monsters as creatures, because a lot of other card games at the time, it did refer to their monsters as creatures, so it was probably just a convention of card games at the time, and how loose they were with the wording of all the effects of monsters in the time period, where they weren't as strict in the wording as they are today. And at number 6, we have Necro Valley. Necro Valley is kind of infamous for its number of erratas and changes to its card's actual effect over the years, so the original wording of this card is quite the treat, where its original card text is as follows. As long as this card remains face up on the field, all effects of magic, trap, and or effect monster cards that involve graveyards are negated, and neither player can remove cards in the graveyard from play. In addition, increase the attack and defense of all monsters that includes Gravekeepers in their name by 500 points. Now, the wording on this card seems like it probably makes practical sense. If you're trying to use cards like Premature Burial or Call of the Haunted, Necro Valley negates those cards' effects since they involve the graveyard so thoroughly. However, what exactly denotes a card that involves the graveyards? If you use Pot of Greed to draw 2 cards, you eventually send Pot of Greed to the graveyard afterwards. Does that mean it involves the graveyard? Foolish Burial only sends a monster from your deck to the graveyard. Is that negated because it involves the graveyard? Now, it may seem as if I'm being pedantic, but these were some real ruling questions that involved Necro Valley because its wording was so vague. You could even argue that Mania or Bug was negated because it destroys monsters, which go to the graveyard. So in order for Konami to try to make less ruling nightmares with Necro Valley's first printing of the effect, they went ahead and tried to fix it 7 other times before it eventually ended on the effect where cards in the graveyard cannot be banished, and negates any card effect that would move a card in the graveyard to a different place, and negates any card effects that change the types or attributes in the graveyard. So the modern version of Necro Valley is much more specific in what it actually stops, and is actually a pretty good field spell card because of how graveyard-centric a lot of decks are. And at number 5, we have Gravedigger Ghoul. The original card text for this was, select 2 monster cards from your opponent's graveyard. These monster cards are removed from play for the remainder of the duel. So basically what this card does is banish 2 cards from your opponent's graveyard. However, this was before banished was a codified keyword, one of the few keywords that actually exist in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and before there were concrete rules on what you could do with cards that were removed from play. So this is another one of those cards which has reminder text on it, trying to tell you what the card does, where it's explaining the concept of removing cards from your opponent's graveyard from play. However, it goes on to say that they're removed from play for the remainder of the duel, which could imply they're not allowed to get those cards back. Even in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, they had cards like Primal Seed, which allowed you to recover banished cards. Although Primal Seed wouldn't come out until 2 years after Gravedigger Ghoul, so in the very early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, a card removed from play really was removed from the game until the end of the duel, because there wasn't really a way to interact with removed from play cards yet. Once they started printing more cards that interacted with banished cards, Gravedigger Ghoul received an errata, which just removed that last line of text that said they were removed from play until the end of the duel. And at number 4, we have Mask of Restrict. This is a continuous trap card which has a floodgate effect that had the original text of, no matter the situation, neither player can offer any monsters as a tribute. Now, the obvious intended use of this card is to make it so monsters can't be tribute summoned, nor be tributed by card effects like that of Kinetic Soldier. However, the wording of this card is incredibly extreme, almost as if it's yelling at you that, no matter the situation, you're not allowed to tribute monsters. Like, for example, say you're at an event, your opponent has a Master Restrict out, someone comes up and threatens you to spill water all over your cards. Unless you tribute a monster, you wouldn't be able to tribute anything because Master Restrict has the effect where it says, no matter the situation, you're not allowed to offer any monsters as tribute. Eventually, the card did get some changes in order to give it card text which was no longer as extreme on the conditions of tributing, where it was changed to just neither player can tribute any monsters under any conditions, then to monsters cannot be tributed, changed again to cards cannot be tributed, before finally being changed to neither player can tribute cards. And at number 3, we have Pot of Greed. For this part of the list, we're going to be looking over its original Japanese text, where the original text of this card reads, when translated to English, pull 2 cards from your deck, destroy Pot of Greed after it is played. Now, you may have noticed something odd about this card's text, besides the very confusing nature of what it actually does. You see, when Yu-Gi-Oh! Was very first released, there were still a couple of rules that were being worked out with how spells and traps would function. and one of those rules was how cards would be sent to the graveyard after they were used. One of the first ideas they had was that every spell and trap card would just stay on the field forever unless the card specifically designated that it would go to the graveyard afterwards, which is why Pot of Greed has the extra effect where it destroys itself after its play. That way it doesn't stay on the field forever. And if you've ever wondered why Swords Revealing Light, a card which stays on the field for 3 turns, is a normal spell card and not a continuous spell card, it's because that card is a holdover from the original ruling, where all cards are just on the field forever until the conditions for how they would leave the field were met. And in Swords Revealing Light's case, it was after 3 turns had passed. And since Pot of Greed was meant to only be used a single time, it would destroy itself immediately after it was played. Eventually, after they changed the rulings, the next text of Pot of Greed was simply to draw 2 cards from your deck. And that's kind of how it stayed ever since, with the most modern version of it simply saying draw 2 cards. And at number 2, we have the 5-headed dragon. This is a fusion monster which in its original version didn't actually have its fusion materials listed on it like other fusion monsters, and instead had its fusion materials listed in its card effect, as well as a whole bunch of other weird stuff on it. The original text reads, "The fusion materials for this card are any 5 dragon type monsters. This monster cannot be special summoned except by fusion summon. This card does not take any battle damage and cannot be destroyed by battle with an earth, water, fire, wind, or dark monster. Battle damage is still inflicted to players." So its effect states what its fusion materials are, which would later be changed just to have 5 dragon type monsters as its fusion materials and removing that line of text. However, the interesting thing about this card is that line of text which reads, "This card does not take any battle damage," which is pretty superfluous because monsters can't take battle damage. Battle damage is something that's done to players, not monsters, so obviously this card doesn't take any battle damage. There's no reason for it to have that line of text at all. It also has the effect where it can't be destroyed by certain attributes of monsters, and then has reminder text that says battle damage is still inflicted to players. Now, I've heard some theories about why this card text probably had its text like this, which is probably explained if we look over the original wording of Waboku. The original text for Waboku is, "Any damage inflicted by an opponent's monster is decreased to 0 during the turn this card is activated." You see how this one also describes monsters as taking damage when that's not a mechanic in Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, the actual effect of this card is that you don't take any battle damage during the turn you use it, and also your monsters can't be destroyed by battle. However, you wouldn't know that unless you looked at the rulings on this card, because the actual text of the card doesn't really explain what the card is supposed to do. And you see, the theory behind the text on these 2 cards is that in other card games at the time, it was common for monsters to have health point values, where when those health values dropped to 0, they would be destroyed. So if you think of Yu-Gi-Oh monsters as having health point values, and the intended effects of both Waboku and 5-headed dragon is protecting them from being destroyed by battle, it makes sense why these 2 cards mentioned they don't take any battle damage, and why they thought wording the original Waboku in this way would be enough to obviously state that it protects monsters from being destroyed by battle, because if your monsters take no battle damage, then they can't be reduced to 0 hit points. Of course, Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't work that way at all, so in future printings of both of these cards, they removed any mentions of monsters taking battle damage, and instead properly just said they can't be destroyed by battle. And at number 1, we have the original text for Polymerization. The first text for this card was, "Fuses 2 or more fusion material monsters to form a new fusion monster." Now, what's interesting about this card is that it doesn't actually explain to you what it does. It reads more like a vanilla monster flavor text than an actual card effect. Because what does it mean to even fuse 2 monsters into a fusion monster? Do you put those monsters on top of themselves like future Xyz monsters? Can you use monsters from your deck? Do they go back to the deck, the graveyard? Well, the reason Polymerization didn't really explain what it did was because there was a ruling in the official rulebook, which had a whole page dedicated to it, explaining how fusion monsters worked. And since the process of fusion summoning was explained in the rulebook, and could only be done with Polymerization, I guess they assumed they didn't actually need to re-explain it on the Polymerization spell card itself. It used to be Polymerization was the only way to go into fusion monsters, so obviously they didn't need to explain how the card worked, because you had to set up your fusion deck with your fusion monsters before the duel began anyway. And if you went through the effort of doing that, you wouldn't really need the reminder text on Polymerization, since it was just an official ruling. However, in the second printing of the card, they actually gave the card a real effect, which explained how fusion summoning worked, where you'd send the monsters from your hand or your side of the field to the graveyard, which are listed as fusion materials on a fusion monster from your fusion deck. And I also read online that another reason they probably left Polymerization without any actual effect was because they weren't 100% sure how fusion summoning would work yet, as the original rulebook required you to have the monsters on your side of the field and didn't allow you to use monsters from your hand. So when they updated the rules, they didn't have to update the card because it never actually explained how it worked. And in fact, there is even a ruling that stated you could only fusion summon with polymerization, which they eventually changed, but remnants of that old rule still exist in a lot of fusion monsters that can bring themselves out with alternative methods, where they all have extra text that says you do not have to use polymerization. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, they'll occasionally print cards which have text in the bottom left-hand corner of them that state they cannot be used in real duels. Usually these cards are given as prize cards to players who win events, and in this video we'll go over the 10 best illegal cards, i.e. cards that you're not allowed to put in your deck, and don't appear on the ban list because these cards are permanently forbidden. And at number 10, we have Chimera, the Master of Beasts. This is a level 9 beast-type monster, which has the effect where, if it attacks your opponent directly and reduces their life points to 0, you win the match. And this effect is shared by like 80% of the illegal cards. Almost all of them are match winner effects. Because you see, in tournaments, players will play a match, which consists of a best 2 out of 3. So they need to win at least 2 duels in order to officially win the match. So with this card, if you win one of those duels with this card's effect, you essentially get a second duel win for free, which actually makes this effect really good as it allows you to win another duel without actually having to do it. And there's only one legal match winner card in the game, and that's Victory Dragon, who himself is a banned card. And the reason this effect is banned is because most people who would actually use this effect would basically get to a game state where they basically already won, and then just stall out until they got out their match winner, and then attack with it. And also, their opponent can just forfeit the duel before the attack goes through, which will completely negate the effect anyway. So it's simultaneously a degenerate effect which encourages players to stall out the duel long enough for them to get off the match-winning effect, and it's also kind of a useless effect because you can bypass it by just forfeiting whenever you want. And all the match winners share the same basic effects and costs, where they can't be special summoned, they all require 3 tribute summons, it's always 3 specific monster types, whereas with the case with Chimera, it's 3 beast-type monsters, and with Victory Dragon, it's 3 dragon-type monsters, and then all their effects are the same, where they just need to attack directly and reduce their life points to 0 with your attack. And the reason I have Chimera on here over all the other match winners, as there are a lot of them, is because this one has one of the highest attack, and is one of the easiest ones to bring out. As with the card Obedience Schooled, you can provide 3 tributes for this card instantly with 3 monsters from your deck, as Obedience Schooled allows you to special summon 3 beast-type monsters from your deck that are level 2 or lower. Other than that, there's not too much that separates the match winner cards from each other. Chimera is a little stronger than Victory Dragon, but really, all of these cards which are illegal, you would just play whichever one fit the type of monsters you played in your deck, if you wanted to actually use them. And at number 9, we have the legendary Dragon of White. This is a match winner Exceeds monster, which requires 3 level 8 monsters as its materials, can only be special summoned by an Exceed summon, and if it attacks your opponent directly and reduces their life points to 0, while this card has a dragon-type monster as one of its Exceeds materials, then you win the match. So basically, like the main deck monsters, except instead of requiring 3 tributes of a specific type, you just need one of the monsters attached to it to be of a certain type. And if all of the illegal Exceeds match winners, Legendary Dragon of White has one of the highest attack at 3000, and is also one of the easiest to bring out as it just requires 3 level 8 monsters, which is a pretty popular level for ease of summoning, especially if this card is used in a Blue Eyes White Dragon deck that its art and name heavily hint at. There are other Exceeds match winners, there's even one with 3000 attack as well, that requires 3 level 8 monsters, except that one requires Beast Warrior types, and I think Dragon types being one of the most plentiful types of monsters in the game probably makes it a little bit better. And also, the ease of access with this card, over having to draw into a main deck monster and tribute 3 specific monsters on the field, I believe makes the Exceeds match winners better than the main deck match winners. They're easier to bring out, and their condition is just easier to fulfill. Coincidentally, I think the Synchro and Link match winners are some of the worst ones, as the Synchro ones require specific materials, 3 of them at that, and are kinda hard to bring out, and the Link ones require you to be co-linked in order to activate their match-winning effect. And at number 8, we have Sakyo, Swordmaster of the Far East. This is a normal Pendulum Monster match winner card, where it has no effect as a normal monster, but
Its Pendulum effect allows you to banish 3 face-up warrior pendulum monsters in order to target another pendulum monster you control who will gain the match-winning effect. I think the pendulum match winners are probably the best of the bunch, since their effects can be activated from the pendulum scale, instead of from the card itself. Of course, the pendulum effect monsters have the same main deck effect as the main deck match winner, so really, I think Saikyo is the best match winner card because it's a normal monster, so you can just use it like a regular normal level 7 pendulum monster, and it also has good scales at 10. So you could just ignore its match-winning effect and have a pretty decent pendulum monster. Whereas all the other match winners are a little too convoluted to use their effects and are very easily bypassed if your opponent knows how to counter the match-winning effect. So since the match-winning effect is kind of useless, Saikyo is the best of the bunch because it can be used much more easily outside of its match-winning effect. And at number 7, we have Creator of Miracles. This is a level 4 monster that has the effect where you can shout the word Zexal Field, then target one C39 Exceeds monster you control, which is usually just the upgraded versions of Utopia, and it can attack directly this turn. And if you activated the effects of 2 other cards during the duel, that monster gains an additional effect during that direct attack, where, if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you win the duel. Now, a card that allows you to attack directly with an Exceeds monster is kind of okay. It's not the best effect in the world, but the fact that you can turn that into a really easy win condition is not half bad. This isn't the best card in the world, but the 2 cards that need to be in the graveyard for this effect combo so well with this card that it kind of deserves a spot on this list. And I'll go over those other 2 cards as this list continues, as all 3 of these cards are illegal ones. Creative Miracles is the only illegal card with a dual winning effect, and also the Korean version of this card has a serial number in the bottom left-hand corner, in place of the limitation text that says this card cannot be used in duels. So technically, the Korean version of this card is legal to play, although the other 2 cards that allow you to get its game-winning effect are correctly made illegal in Korea as well, so it's not possible to use its dual-winning effect in a real duel. And at number 6, we have Masahiro the Dark Clown. This is a flip effect monster whose flip effect allows you to choose a flip effect monster in your graveyard, and this card's effect permanently becomes that card's effect. So basically, it allows you to copy a flip effect from your grave. Although, I don't know if the conditions would be met to activate that flip effect monster or not. I assume it would be, so if you copy the effects of Pot of the Forbidden, you can activate one of 4 really powerful effects, which would give this card, by association, a pretty powerful flip effect. Assuming it doesn't meet the requirements of the flip effect though, your options are much more limited. Generally, cards that can copy effects in the grave are pretty powerful. Copying a flip effect from the grave is only really good if you can copy a really good one, like Pot of the Forbidden. Now, this card is based off of Sagi the Dark Clown, and was created in the likeness of one of the finalists from the first Yu-Gi-Oh! National Conference in Japan. And then this card, along with 2 others, were handed out to top 8 players during the second national conference in 2001. Although Masahiro the Dark Clown has the best effect of the 3, which is why he's the only one who makes it on this list. And at number 5, we have Get Your Game On. This is a continuous spell card that can only be activated if you were present at the 2007 Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading Card Game World Championship. And if you fulfill this condition, this card has the continuous effect where it just doubles the attacks of all Elemental Hero Neospacing monsters you control. Now, a blanket doubling the attack of all of your Elemental Hero cards is honestly a pretty good effect, because usually, cards which increase your attack aren't very valuable, but this is a ridiculously high amount of attack gain to all of your monsters. And if this card was legal, you can guarantee that it would probably see some play in competitive decks, since Elemental Heroes do occasionally see competitive play, and they would love to double the attack of all their monsters. And here's the thing about the activation requirement. Your opponent can't actually know if you were present at the 2007 Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading Card Game World Championship. So you can just say that you were present, with the proof being that you own this card, and just activate it anyway. And since they can't disprove that you weren't there, they really have no grounds to deny this card being activated, other than this fact that this card cannot be used in official duels, as it's the only card in the game where your opponent can't possibly know if you meet the activation requirements or not. Which is a little caveat of this card. This is also the only illegal card in the game which states that it cannot be used in official duels, whereas all the other ones say they can't be used in duels, period. So in non-competitive matches against friends and stuff, this card can technically be played. And this is also the only card in the TCG that has text on the back of the card, which basically just says, "Thanks for attending the 2007 World Championship. This card is not for sale." Now, seeing as this card's effects are much more useful than the match winner effects that are easily bypassed if you know what you're doing, I'd say this one easily takes a higher spot on the list than those ones. And at number 4, we have Winning Formula. This is a normal spell card that can be activated if your opponent controls a monster, and if you shout the phrase, "The winning formula is complete." You can special summon a numbered monster from your extra deck, and then attach this card to that monster as an Exceeds material. So essentially, you get to cheat out any numbered monster from your extra deck for free, and then give it an Exceeds material. This effect is actually really good, as there's so many good targets for this card that it's not really worth listing them all out. Basically, you could just stack your extra deck with cards that you like and get you out of any situation, and then this card will allow you to bring out whichever one you need. This card is kind of broken, as usually being able to cheat a monster out of the extra deck requires all kinds of special conditions or a hefty cost in order to accomplish that. And this card has none of that, and it gives that Exceeds monster a free material. Although the next 3 cards on this list are a little bit more broken than this, so it only gets the number 4 spot on this list. And at number 3, we have Card of Last Will. This is a trap card that has the effect to draw cards until you have 5 in your hand, if the attack of a monster you control becomes 0 by a card effect. So if you have a way to lower the attack of one of your monsters to 0 by a card effect, like with a Galaxy 0 as an example, then you could potentially draw 5 cards from your deck. Being able to draw up to 5 cards is super good, kind of brokenly really, and this card would absolutely see play if it wasn't an illegal card. Some of the best cards in the game that are banned don't even allow you to draw up to 5 cards, and even Morphing Jar, which allows you to draw 5 cards, has effects similar to this one, gives your opponent 5 cards as well. And even with the somewhat balanced nature of that effect, it was still in the ban list for years and is currently limited to 1 copy per deck. Now, this was the first ever illegal trap card to be released, and when it was first announced, it didn't list itself as being an illegal card in the database. So people believe that this broken card was going to be released as an actual legit card for a bit, but it does properly have the text that indicates it cannot be used in a real duel, so it was never a big issue. And at number 2, we have Creator of Hope. Now, this card has the effect where if it's in your graveyard because it was destroyed by an opponent's card, and your life points are lower than your opponent's, during your draw phase before you draw a card, you can shout, "I'm feeling the flow," in order to activate its effect, which allows you to choose any card from your deck and place it on top of your deck, which you'll then be able to draw immediately after. So basically, it has a floating effect that allows you to search any card from your deck during your draw phase. Now, being able to search any card from the deck is a pretty good effect, and this card is not that difficult to pull off, as you can easily force the activation of this card by just crashing into one of your opponent's monsters. And this card was released alongside Winning Formula and Creator of Miracles, so it makes sense that Creator of Miracles requires the other 2 cards in order to activate its effect, and the other 2 cards are much better than Creator of Miracles, and they both directly contribute to activating Creator of Miracles effects. So if all 3 of these cards were legal to play, one of them would definitely be banned because they are kind of too good, but not as good as the number 1 spot on this list. And at number 1, we have the Seal of Orichalcos, the illegal version, which shares the exact same name as the card that does exist in the actual game, the Seal of Orichalcos. The illegal version of this card has the effects where this card cannot be negated, destroyed, or removed from the field. It increases the attack of all of your monsters by 500. It has a hand trap effect where you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to negate and destroy any effect. This card allows you to use your spell and trap card zones as monster zones, and if a monster in your spell and trap card zone has a monster directly on top of it, the card in the back row cannot be attacked while a monster is in front of it. And finally, the last effect of this card is whoever loses the duel loses their soul to their opponent. So this is the only card in the game which can make you lose your soul if you lose the duel. I'm not really sure how you enforce that part of it though, but if you kind of ignore that effect, everything else about this card is pretty bonkers. This card has full immunity to basically any kind of removal, and it's the perfect hand trap that can stop anything. And it also allows you to control a potential of 12 monsters, if you count the 2 link zones, which is an insane effect in of itself. If this card was legal, it would probably be the strongest card in the game and played in pretty much every deck, and probably just because of that really good hand trap effect. And I guess this card was eventually released in the game, just in a severely nerfed version, where the real card only prevents destruction once per turn. Instead of having full immunity from being removed, it can only be activated once per duel, it locks you out of your extra deck, and it destroys all your special summon monsters when you activate it. And its effects on field are to increase the attack of all your monsters by 500, which I think is the only effect that stayed from the broken version, and it offers you some kind of attack protection, where your opponent can't target your lowest attack monsters for attacks. The illegal version of the Silver Calcos only has 15 copies in existence, and they were only given out to employees of Upper Deck Entertainment. And the current status of these cards is unknown, as Konami no longer works with them and reclaimed all the cards when they cut their contract. Although some employees do claim to have copies of it, and the card limitation text on this one says that it's not an official Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG card, which is pretty specific, which is also a little bit different than all the other cards that say they cannot be used in duels.
Yu-Gi-Oh! Has come a long way since Legends of the Blue Eyes White Dragon, and currently features over 10,000 different cards. With such a wide array of choices available, duelists have discovered hundreds of different wild and wacky tech options that can be used to strengthen certain strategies, or be used to counter others. So let's take a look at some of the strongest tech choices of the past year, if they're any good, and why they managed to see any amount of play in the first place. Crawling in at number 10 is Necromane King, a card with an effect that's seemingly impossible to activate, but if you do trigger it, it basically wins the game all on its own. You see, when Necromane King activates, it becomes the end phase, no matter what phase of the turn your opponent was in previously, acting as a turn skip that can stop your opponent from playing and force them to pass the turn to you. The issue with Necromane King, however, is that in order for it to actually use its effect, it must be sent to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect during their turn. And for a long while, this was the nail in the coffin for Necromane King. Its effect was just too difficult to actually activate. And while there are a few gimmicky strategies that were centered around using cards like Gyroid and Vader to force your opponent to trigger it, Necromane King never really saw any widespread use, until the release of the Ishizu cards. You see, the latest Ishizu cards can be split into 2 different categories. There's the modern Keldo and Mudora, which are known as the Shufflers, because they banish themselves from the graveyard in order to target up to 3 cards in either player's graveyard and shuffle them into their deck at quick effect speed. And then there's Agito and Kelbeck, the Millers, which both have graveyard effects that trigger when they're sent from the hand or deck to the graveyard, which causes both players to mill the top 5 cards of the deck. Every one of these Ishizu monsters has seen play in tier limits, and is a big reason for their tier 0 success. It's real easy to mill the Ishizu cards with the effects of the tier limit monsters, and when you do, you either get free graveyard interaction with Keldo or Mudora, or you get to mill 5 with Kelbeck or Agito, allowing for tier limits to access more of the graveyard effects so they can continue fusing and extending even further. But one of the main downsides of Agito and Kelbeck is that while they both give you a ton of free mills that you can take advantage of, your opponent also has to mill 5 cards as well. This is where Necromane King shines, because while there are a number of different graveyard effects that tier limits can accidentally trigger for you, like Nimble Angler if you're on Sprite, or even your own tier limit monsters, there are very few as game-winningly strong as Necromane King. Now, unfortunately, Necromane King, despite how good it was in theory against tier limits, didn't really stick around in people's deck lists for too long. It just relied too heavily on your opponent using both Kelbeck and Agito for it to be reliably triggered, which was becoming less and less common as tier limit lists began either focusing more on their Shufflers and their Millers, or would make Abyss Dweller before triggering any of their Millers so your opponent couldn't gain any advantage from the graveyard when you both milled. This, unfortunately, meant that Necromane King became mostly unplayable, since tier was already playing around the opponent having good mills anyway, so it didn't really make much sense to play a bricky card that was unlikely to actually do anything. Currently, Necromane King isn't seeing too much competitive play, but it hasn't fallen off completely. Even though it isn't really used as an effective punishment for tier limits anymore, it is still played as a centerpiece in certain Dark World strategies, as the effect of the new Grapha Fusion changes an effect an opponent activates to cause you to discard a card. And if you choose to discard Necromane King, it's an easy way to skip your opponent's turn, since it technically still counts as your opponent's card effect. But as it stands right now, it's definitely not as strong as other tech choices that can be used to counter tier limits. And pouring in at number 9 is Magical Spring, a quick play spell card that has the potential to draw you a ton of cards. But it only draws cards equal to the number of face-up spell and trap cards your opponent controls, and then discards cards equal to the number of face-up spell and trap cards you control. So, if you're facing a board of 3 face-up floodgates, you actually get to draw 3 cards, and then discard 1 since you control a face-up Magical Spring. This can be a pretty strong effect on par the likes of Graceful Charity, but it actually comes with a major downside since it prevents your opponent's spell and trap cards from being destroyed or having their effects negated until the end of your opponent's next turn. This is usually what holds Magical Spring back from seeing too much competitive success, as the decks that you're usually going to be able to use it against are back row strategies reliant on continuous trap cards that are going to actively benefit from the floodgates being protected, even if you have the potential to draw a ton of cards. However, in 2022, the stars aligned for Magical Spring, where you could use it against the best decks of the format without worry about the downside, and against other strategies, this downside was actually a benefit instead. You see, up until the May ban lists, after the release of the Adventure token cards, Prank Kids Adventure was undoubtedly one of the best decks you could play, and it ended off on multiple face-up spell and trap cards that you didn't have to out in order to actually play, allowing you to draw a ton of cards to find your important board breakers or engine pieces. But that's not all. Because Magical Spring wasn't just a graceful charity in this format, it was also really strong into scythe locking strategies that just so happened to play the Adventure engine. These types of decks would often use Artifact Dagda in order to set Artifact Scythe from their deck as a spell card, and then link some Inverte Anaconda to go into Destiny Hero Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, which could easily pop that set Scythe on your opponent's turn and lock them out of the extra deck, effortlessly winning the game against most strategies. But if you chain Magical Spring to the Adventure of Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer on your turn, your opponent's spell and trap cards, including that set Scythe, won't be able to be destroyed by either player's card effects. This lets you draw a ton of free cards, all while stopping you from being floodgated out of the game. Unfortunately, Magical Spring doesn't see too much play right now. The time where it saw play was the perfect storm of everything going right for the card. But if Scythe decks do begin to see play again, alongside the Adventure engine, it could potentially be in people's decks once more. And patrolling the streets at number 8 is Beat Cop from the Underworld, the third monster in the Underworld series of monsters. Beat Cop is actually a generic link monster, but can use any two monsters as material. However, it doesn't have an effect unless it's summoned with two dark monsters with different names. But if you do summon it with two dark monsters, it gains an effect which allows you to tribute a monster and target a face-up card in the field to place a patrol counter on it. And if a card the patrol counter would be destroyed either by battle or card effect, you remove the patrol counter instead. This effect actually has a lot of utility. It can be used to protect an important boss monster from powerful board breakers like Dark Hole or Raigeki. It can be used to protect your key spell and traps like Gene Raider Boss Stage or Pacifist, or it can be used to protect an important floodgate. This is precisely why Sprite decks were running Beat Cop for a while. You see, post-Power of the Elements, Mystic Mine was still a really powerful staple that could be used to put a stop to a ton of different strategies. However, decks like Tearlaments had native Mystic Mine outs, usually revolving around the pop effect of Pure Arena and cards like Fusion Substitute and Pot of Avarice in order to trigger it. However, a lot of removal options available for Mystic Mine are based around destroying cards. This is why Sprite found so much value in Beat Cop from the Underworld. They would Mystic Mine your opponent, summon out two Dark Sprite monsters, and then go into Beat Cop from the Underworld so they could put a patrol counter in Mystic Mine. And because Beat Cop tributes a monster for cost, you can tribute Beat Cop itself to leave you with no monsters, locking your opponent under Mystic Mine. And since the protection of patrol counters is tied to the counters and not Beat Cop, the protection still applies. This meant that going second, landing a Mystic Mine with the patrol counter on it could just be game winning, since Tearlaments usually only played Mystic Mines outs as one-ofs. Beat Cop is a very interesting card, though with Mystic Mine banned, its best synergy is no longer available. However, its protection effect is still very strong and can come up again someday, especially for how generic it is. And hopping into number 7 is D3S Frog, a GX era fusion that technically supports the Frog archetype, but has never actually seen play, until now, for how difficult it is to summon. Basically, to actually summon D3S Frog, you need to fuse not just one, not two, but 3 copies of Des Frog to bring it out. And if you do, you get a bad beat stick with a mediocre effect, as D3S Frog's only real effect is that it gains 500 attack for every Treeborn Frog in your graveyard. D3S Frog is not a card you ever want to summon, even in Frogs, because its materials is incredibly specific and requires a ton of resources to go into, especially when a card like Guardian Chimera has a way better effect that allows you to clear the field and draw cards, while also just having a higher attack stat. However, even though 3DS Frog is one of the worst fusion monsters, it managed to see play in the extra decks of the currently Tier 0 Tearlaments. Prior to the release of Darkwing Blast, Tearlaments was an incredibly strong Tier 1 contender, but had yet to reach the heights of its power because it was missing a ton of tools that would get it later sets. So a lot of different unique cards and engines managed to see play in Tearlaments, with one of the best available being branded in High Spirits. With the effect of High Spirits, you can reveal a level 8 Aqua Fusion monster with 2500 attack or defense in your extra deck, send an Aqua Tearlament monster from your hand to the graveyard, and then add Albion the Shrouded Dragon. This netted you a free draw Albion and allowed you to trigger the graveyard effects of your tier monsters. However, tiers still didn't have access to Tearlament's Rucalis yet, the best target for High Spirits, and so instead had to scour the card pool to find another level 8 Aqua Fusion monster with 2500 attack or defense until Rucalis was released. And D3S Frog was the only monster in the game that happened to fit that description. So for a while, tier limits had to play D3S Frog in their extra deck if they wanted what High Spirits gave them. Now, even though D3S Frog was never being summoned, its specific type and attribute made it a necessary choice in tier limits, and one that saw a decent amount of success, especially in tier lists playing a heavier branded package. D3S Frog is probably never going to see play again because of how bad of a card it is, but if tier limits Recalus ever finds its way onto the ban list, tier might just have to go back to using it anyway. Posting itself at number 6 is Messenger of Peace, one of the oldest cards on this list that manages to see play because of its really simple effect. And this effect just stopped all monsters 1500 more attack from declaring an attack while it's face up on the field. But during each of your standby phases, you either have to pay 100 life points or destroy the card. Compared to a lot of other floodgates in the game, like Goes in Match or There Can Be Only One, Messenger of Peace is definitely a lot weaker. But a key issue with these floodgates is that for as strong as they are, they still allow your opponent to attack to either threaten your life points, or to go into zoo so they can wipe your field. This is an issue that Runic had for a while. Runic can play a whole host of different floodgates to stop your opponent from comboing off so that you can eventually deck them out with your quick play spells. This gave the deck a ton of synergy with Mystic Mine, since you could stop your opponent from using monster effects or attacking and just gradually banish cards over the course of several turns. But once Mystic Mine was banned, Runic was faced with the ever-present threat of the battle phase. While clearing your opponent's board with lava golems and flashing fire can be game-winning, your opponent is eventually going to find a way to deal damage to your life points, or a way to get to Zeus, leaving you a sitting duck. This is what Messenger of Peace prevents, because while it's face up on the field, most monsters aren't going to be able to attack, leaving you safe from almost any threat. The best part is that Messenger of Peace has particularly strong synergy with Moonin, one of the Runic monsters you can summon from the extra deck with your quick play spells, because Moonin has 2000 defense, which makes it fairly difficult to out by battle, especially so a Messenger of Peace is on the field, stopping any high attack monsters from beating over Moonin. And because Moonin gains 1000 life points during each of your end phases, you'd never have to worry about paying the cost of Messenger of Peace, letting you stall with the card really easily until your opponent eventually decks out. Messenger of Peace is definitely an interesting choice, and shows how powerful floodgates, even weak ones, can be. Runic does benefit from a ton of other floodgates, but Messenger of Peace is definitely one of the strangest parts of the decks that just so happens to work really, really well. And shining at number 5, we have Crystal Beast Emerald Tortoise, one of the worst Crystal Beast monsters in the game. Because on its own, Emerald Tortoise doesn't really do anything. It has a standard Crystal Beast effect, which allows you to place it face up in your spell and trap card zone as a continuous spell when it's destroyed as a monster, rather than send it to the graveyard. And its unique effect just allows you to target a monster in the field that's attacked this turn and change it to defense position. Neither of these effects do anything powerful or important for most strategies, to the point where Emerald Tortoise isn't even run in current Crystal Beast decks, as you'd rather play stronger Crystal Beasts like Pegasus and Carbuncle before you even start considering cards like Emerald Tortoise. But even with how bad Emerald Tortoise is in its own deck, it actually saw a fair amount of competitive play this year because of how it worked in tier limits. One of the key strengths of tier limits is being able to mill a ton of cards so that you can take advantage of the graveyard effects, and as a result, they would play a ton of different cards with powerful graveyard effects they could use if they were randomly milled. Fairy Tail Snow gave the deck a strong piece of interaction. Vivid Tail and Fusion Substitute allowed the deck to easily out Mystic Mine, and even the Paleozoics gave you free body after you summon them back to the field. But another great graveyard effect that saw a decent amount of play in tier limits was Rainbow Bridge of Salvation. This graveyard effect lets you banish it in order to add a Crystal Beast monster and any field spell in the game from your deck to your hand. This gave tier limits a ton of options when it milled it. You could use it to grab Peeler Rhino to get your play started, Zombie World if you were facing down Fluent Rees, or even Mystic Mine if you were going second. One of the key issues with Rainbow Bridge of Salvation, however, is that it required that a Crystal Beast monster was in your deck in order to use it. This meant that if you were playing something like Topaz Tiger or Amber Mammoth, drawing that Crystal Beast or even milling it meant that Salvation was pretty much offline forever. However, Emerald Tortoise just so happens to be the perfect card for tier limits to pair with Salvation. And having that card in hand or in the graveyard was even a benefit for the deck, because Emerald Tortoise is an Aqua monster. This meant that drawing or milling Emerald Tortoise wasn't a big deal, as if you wanted to use the graveyard effect of your Bridge of Salvation, you could just use the graveyard effect of your tier limit monsters to shuffle back Emerald Tortoise in order to grab tier limits Kit Kalos, a fusion monster whose required materials are any tier limit monster plus any Aqua type monster. So Bridge of Salvation not only gave you any field spell you wanted, it also gave you a free card that you can actually use as a fusion material. With Trevi Karma soon to be released, however, it's unlikely that tier limits will end up playing Rainbow Bridge again, since Trevi Karma is just Rainbow Bridge for decks in the Visa Starfrost lore that just has built in more utility, especially since you don't need to play a card that doesn't really do anything in your main deck for it. But for the time it was around in tier limit decks, Rainbow Bridge managed to make one of the worst Crystal Beast monsters in the game an absolute boon to the now tier 0 archetype. Stretching the number 4 spot is number 29, Mannequin Cat, A rank 2 monster that's managed to see a ton of competitive play this year because of Sprite, and has allowed for a ton of old and strange cards to shut down other meta strategies. Malignant Cat has 2 effects. The first allows you to target a monster in your opponent's graveyard and special summon it to their side of the field. Now normally this would be a pretty bad effect, but it also feeds into Malignant Cat's second effect, which you can trigger whenever a monster is special summoned to your opponent's side of the field. And whenever it's activated, you can target any monster your opponent controls, and then special summon a monster from your hand, deck, or graveyard with the same type or attribute as that monster targeted. Essentially, this second effect is an E-tally for any monster in the game, but only if your opponent controls a monster with the same type or attribute as the monster you want to summon. And so, Sprite plays different Malignant Cat targets to side into depending on the matchup. If your opponent is playing 2 elements, you can either play the End of Anubis, since most tier monsters are dark, or Tetsu Arat Numen, since most tier monsters are aqua. Both of these cards act as floodgates, which can stop tiers from playing entirely if they're summoned at the right time, since End of Anubis is basically Abyss Dweller, and Numen stops any monster with over 1800 attack from being summoned. But if you happen to be in a Sprite mirror match, you might instead choose to summon Thunder King Ryo, since all the Sprite monsters are Thunder monsters. This prevents Sprite from being able to use the search effects of Sprite Blue and Sprite Jet, and could even be used to stop Link or XC summons of key boss monsters with its second effect. And even when against decks that don't special summon at all, Malignant Cat still has a ton of utility. Against Fluenderese, for example, it may appear like Malignant Cat can't really do anything, but it's actually a really important tool for Sprite to be able to play through an opponent's Dimension Shifter. Because if your opponent activates Dimension Shifter, you can then XC summon Malignant Cat and use Malignant Cat's first effect to summon that shifter from your opponent's graveyard to their side of the field. This then allows you to trigger the second effect of Malignant Cat to summon out Chaos Hunter from your deck, yet another floodgate which prevents your opponent from banishing any cards at all, restricting the Fluenderese engine and preventing some of their strongest cards from being used at all. Overall, Malignant Cat is actually an absurdly strong card that's only managed to begin seeing play again because of how easily Sprite can access it. But now it's seen play, Malignant Cat has allowed for a whole host of strange and quirky monsters that otherwise wouldn't have seen the light of day to not only see play, but be integral for winning games. And it, alongside its targets, will likely be great tools in Sprite for years to come. Being summoned to this list at number 3 is Ra's Disciple, a piece of the Egyptian god support with one of the most restrictive floodgates in the game. Disciple's first effect is actually incredible, as it allows you to swarm the field up to 2 other copies of itself whenever it's summoned, and if that's where the effect ended, this card would have actually been a really stellar way of generating free materials for Link or XC summoning. But it's Disciple's other effect which makes this card so terrible, as while you control it, you cannot special summon any other monsters at all, except by the effect of Ra's Disciple, locking it out of your extra deck and main deck monsters. And you can't even tribute it over for something like Abystial, as Disciple can't be tributed except for the tribute summon of one of the Egyptian god cards. Essentially, if you summoned out Ra's Disciple to your side of the field, you're locking yourself out of doing anything else apart from summoning an Egyptian god, which is why Ra's Disciple never really saw too much play outside of Egyptian god decks, despite the advantage its first effect could generate. But this year, Ra's Disciple has actually seen a ton of use in a deck that doesn't play any Egyptian gods at all, specifically because of its floodgate effect. You see, branded decks would actually use Ra's Disciple as a fusion material when fusing for Albion the Branded Dragon, since Ra's Disciple is a light monster. So you would use the effect of Aluber to search for Branded Fusion from your deck, then use Branded Fusion to summon Albion with Ra's Disciple in Fallen of Albaz. Then you would use the effect of Albion to fusion summon Lubellion by banishing Albaz from your graveyard and Aluber from your field, and with the effect of Lubellion you would shuffle back Albion and Albaz to summon out Mirajade the Iceblade Dragon. After that, you would use the effect of Mirajade to banish itself and another copy of Albion into graveyard. Then, during your end phase, Albion can set Branded Expulsion to your field. Then, during your opponent's turn, with the effect of Expulsion, you can tribute your on-field Albion to target your banished Aluber and Ra's Disciple in your graveyard, and summon out Aluber to your field in defense position, while giving Ra's Disciple to your opponent. This locks most decks out of play in the game entirely. They can't link off Ra's Disciple because of its floodgate, and they can't crash it if you summon it to their field in defense position because you can't change the battle position of a monster during the turn it's summoned, leaving normal summoning as the only option most decks have. This is basically an FTK for most decks. But others, like Fluenderese, can actually function incredibly well under Ra's Disciple since the entire deck is based around normal summoning. And in Master Duel for a while, this was actually a pretty prominent issue as Fluenderese was a really popular deck prior to the statue ban, which made Ra's Disciple a risky gambit, as it either won you the game on the spot or lost hard to Fluenderese. So to counter that, branded decks would actually pivot to yet another terrible card that they could give to their opponent to floodgate them out of the game. Yugioh, the Supreme Magical Force, has a really similar effect to Ra's Disciple, and can be summoned to your opponent's field with a combo very similar to the one to bring out Ra's Disciple. But the key difference is that Yugioh stops all summons. So in Master Duel, it was actually the go-to option for Expulsion over Ra's Disciple, because it also stopped Fluenderese from playing the game. Both Yugioh and Disciple are undoubtedly terrible cards, but even despite how weak they can be, Branded Expulsion has managed to turn them into terrifying threats that can be used to lock your opponent out of the game entirely with self-restrictive floodgates. Winding up to number 2 is Wind Up Kitten, an often forgotten member of the Wind Up archetype that saw a spike in play this year because of its level and powerful removal effect. And this effect is very simple but deceptively strong, as it lets you target a monster your opponent controls and return it to the hand. But you can only use this effect of Wind Up Kitten once per copy on the field. This effect represents a free way to remove an opponent's monster from the field. This is a really strong effect, but one that decks haven't been able to take advantage of until now because of how hard Wind Up Kitten was to access. But because Wind Up Kitten is level 2, it actually became a really valuable asset for Runic Sprite. Runic Sprite is a great deck, but it has its own fair share of weaknesses. The Runic cards force you to skip your next battle phase, so it was actually fairly difficult to remove your opponent's threats and boss monsters from the field during your turn. The deck definitely has its fair share of options, like Onibimaru and Flashing Fire, but losing the battle phase meant that losing out on one of your best ways to clear your opponent's field, and if you use Flashing Fire on a tier limit monster, you just trigger its graveyard effect. And that's where Wind Up Kitten came in. Because Wind Up Kitten is level 2, it can be summoned off a Gigantic Sprite, and then you can use the effect of Kitten to bounce one of your opponent's monsters to the hand, making it a really nice way to clear your opponent's monsters and was particularly effective against tier limits since it didn't trigger their graveyard effects since they'd be bounced back to the extra deck. But that's not all, because you can also link off Wind Up Kitten and Gigantic to link summon Sprite Elf, and then use the effect of Elf to bring back Wind Up Kitten from the graveyard. And because Kitten is treated as a different card when you summon it back from the graveyard, you can use this effect again to bounce yet another monster your opponent controls, giving you free removal every turn so long as you re-summon out Kitten with Elf. Nowadays, Kitten is very rarely played, even in Sprite, but for the brief period that it did see play, it was an incredibly effective tool for clearing away your opponent's board, especially in a deck that rarely ever had access to its battle phase. But even for as strong as Kitten was, there is one more card that shined even brighter than it in 2022. Swimming into the number 1 spot on this list is King of the Swamp, another really old card that was released in 2004 and has only now just managed to really start seeing a ton of play in the metagame 18 years later. Like most older cards, King of the Swamp's effects are very simple. Its main effect allows you to discard it from your hand in order to add a copy of Polymerization from your deck to your hand. And King of the Swamp's other effect allows it to be substituted as material for any fusion material that's specifically listed on a fusion monster, as long as the other materials used to fusion summon that monster are correct. Every aspect of King of the Swamp has allowed for tier limits to take advantage of the card more so than any other card on this list. The fact that it can add Polymerization for free has allowed tier limits access to one of the strongest generic fusion monsters in the game, Guardian Chimera, which gives them an extra option to clear away an opponent's field while also drawing cards for free. But that's not all, because King of the Swamp also just so happens to be an Aqua type monster. So when you discard it to the graveyard to search Poly, you've set up your graveyard already, so that when you send a tier limit monster to the graveyard, you can use its effect to fuse it and King of the Swamp into Kid Kalos and combo from there. By far, the most appealing aspect of King of the Swamp for tier limits is its substitution effect, which allows them easy access to their own fusion boss monster, as well as the fusion boss monsters of other decks. With the strongest example so far being how the deck can access Grapha, Dragon Overlord of the Dark World, the latest Dark World boss monster. You see, Grapha's effect is actually incredible for tier limits, as it changes the effect of your opponent's monster or normal spell or trap card to force the controller of Grapha to discard a card instead. And if you discard a tier limit, you're sent it to the graveyard by a card effect, allowing you to use its effective fusion summon and combo off on your opponent's turn after negating one of their combo pieces. One of the key issues with Grapha, however, is that it requires the original Grapha in order to summon, a card which is great for Dark Worlds, but not something you'd want to run in tier limits. King of the Swamp remedies this issue, as now instead of having to play a brick that does nothing for your deck in order to access new Grapha, you can instead use King of the Swamp to act as the original Grapha for a fusion summon. And because Fusion Grapha's other materials is a dark monster, which most of the tier limits are, the card becomes laughably easy to go into. But King of the Swamp's utility doesn't even stop there. In the OCG, tier limits have been around for a lot longer than the TCG and have had a recent ban list which saw tier limit Kid Kalos, one of the deck's biggest combo pieces, completely banned, as well as a ton of limits to the other tier cards. And you would think this would make tier limits unplayable, since banning Kid Kalos meant they can no longer access one of their best end board pieces, tier limits Rukalos, since one of its fusion materials is Kid Kalos. However, King of the Swamp has allowed for Rukalos to still be summoned in the OCG, since Rukalos just so happens to specifically mention Kid Kalos, allowing you to fuse any tier limit name with King of the Swamp to access Rukalos easily. So even with all of the hate it's received in the Forbidden Limited list, tier limits is still around in the OCG, partly due to how it specifically synergizes with King of the Swamp. A ton of strange and old cards have seen competitive play this year, but none are as unique or as strong as King of the Swamp. And for as long as tier limits is relevant to the deck, King of the Swamp is going to be a great card for them to fall back on, especially if the deck receives the same kind of treatment in the TCG as it did in the OCG. But even as it stands right now, it's the strongest but strangest card of 2022. Konami often makes mistakes with card design, which is why the Forbidden Limited list exists in the first place. However, sometimes they attempt to fix these cards by changing how they work instead of limiting how players use it, for the better or for the worse. And in this video, we're going over some of Konami's worst attempts at eradicating cards to balance them out. Starting us off at number 10, we have Treeborn Frog. This is a level 1 water aqua monster with 100 attack and defense. Its original effect says that during your standby phase, if this card is in your graveyard and you don't control a Treeborn Frog or any spell or trap cards, it can special summon itself. Treeborn Frog was a very good card for Monarch-centered strategies back in the day. Being able to get tribute fodder every single turn for no cost was something no other card could do. And as duels took way more turns back then, you'd be able to trigger a Treeborn a dozen times in the same duel and have it provide value every turn. Another one of Treeborn's great attributes was how versatile it could be, as its revival effect was not once per turn. This meant that if you can get it off the field during the standby phase, you'd be able to bring it out again. You could use this interaction to do things like an enemy controller to tribute the Treeborn to steal an opponent's monster, and then get your frog again afterwards. The way this card was eroded was that its revival effect became a soft once per turn. This didn't interfere with the combos such as the Econ one, as that card is treated as another copy when it leaves the graveyard, but it made this card lose some key interactions. For example, when facing a Light and Darkness Dragon who can negate effects at the cost of 500 attack and defense, you could repeatedly trigger Treeborn in the graveyard to drain Light and Darkness Dragon's negates all at once. For a more modern example, say if Appaloosa negates your Treeborn in the graveyard, you'd be able to attempt to bring it back again. This errata made it so that you can no longer do this for both situations, as you'd only be able to trigger each unique copy of Treeborn in the graveyard once. This is just the first of the many unwarranted erratas in this list, and even if they did randomly nerf a card that hasn't been relevant in forever with it, at least it was only a slight hit. And now at number 9, we have Toon World. This continuous spell currently only has an activation condition, which says you must pay 1000 life points to activate this card. Despite not really having an effect, Toon World has managed to see play a couple of times throughout the years. Even if Toons as a whole have never been a competitive strategy, the existence of Toon Table of Contents, a universal searcher for the archetype which can also search itself, boosts the playability of almost every one of these cards. Most commonly, this one was used in FTK decks played alongside Royal Magical Library, which can draw you cards if you activate multiple spells in the same turn. Toon World has some nice synergy in these decks since it can be bounced back to the hand with Giant Trune to get another spell activation, and it also lowers your life points, which helps for FTKs that use Reversal Quiz or Life Equalizer. One thing most people don't know is that Toon World has actually received an errata before it was released in the West. In the original OCG printing, on top of requiring 1000 life points to be activated, you'd also have to pay an additional 500 life points during each of your standby phases or else it'd be destroyed. But if it left the field, you'd get all the life points you paid for its maintenance costs back. This errata did buff the card by a small bit, but it does raise the question of why would Konami cut out most of this card's effects like this? It's not like this buff was going to make Toons anywhere near playable at the time. Though it's not like they'd ever end up doing that, since Toon Kingdom haven't managed to do so despite being one of the most over-tuned pieces of legacy support out there. The reason why they changed it is unknown, but it can probably be brushed up as to an oddity from the really early Yu-Gi-Oh years, where countless erratas had to be thrown around, though this seems to be one of the less justifiable ones. And at number 8, we have Brain Control. This is a normal spell card which lets you pay 100 life points to target a face-up monster your opponent controls that can be normal summoner set, and take control of it until the end phase. In its original state, this card could target anything instead of just normal summonable monsters, making it into what's essentially a change of heart with a slight downside. For that reason, it was very quickly limited after its release, as it was too strong for the metagame back then. This card and Mind Control both became must-have staples when the Synchro era started, as you now had way more ways of getting rid of stolen monsters by using it as a material. These two were in most decks that had any tuner access, though Brain Control was clearly the superior one, as Mind Control still stopped the monster from attacking or being tributed over, and that's why Brain was the one that ended up being banned. This card remained on the Forbidden list until 2017, when it finally got an errata that made the card completely unplayable. Brain Control would have still been a decent card with its new effect back in 2009, when you were still taking main deck monsters with it anyway, but the same didn't fly for the modern era. Not being able to take extra deck monsters meant that often you wouldn't be able to take anything out of your opponent's board, as that's what's pretty much every deck ended on. On the flip side, Mind Control, which is still allowed at 1 and didn't get an errata, had its restrictions matter less and less with time because of how less the battle phase mattered, and how easily you could use your opponent's monster as a material. By this point, you could either synchro or Xyz with whatever you took, and this would only become easier with the introduction of link monsters, making it so that pretty much every deck had a way to get rid of monsters on their side of the field. This made Mind Control a staple throughout all of the Link era, and it was even allowed at 3 copies for quite a few formats, putting into question how necessary it was to kill Brain Control like that, as it's only slightly better than Mind Control. This question was finally put to rest when they freed Change of Heart itself, the stronger version of both of these cards, earlier in 2022, and it doesn't even see that much play now. The issue with this errata is how it completely killed off the card for good, as it became 100% inferior to every other option then, when power creep would have made it fine to have it at 1 in a few years anyway. And at number 7, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. This is a level 8 Dark Dragon monster with 3000 attack and 2500 defense, which must be special summoned by banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard. It has the effect to pay 1000 life points to send all cards in both players' hands and on the field to the graveyard, and then burn your opponent for 300 points of damage for each card sent this way. Pre-errata Chaos Emperor Dragon was one of the best monsters in the game when it came out. Its summoning condition, a staple in pretty much all Chaos monsters for the time, made it easy to bring out as most good monsters around were light or dark. Its effect to wipe the field made for a deadly combo when used with Sangan, that can be used to search out Yugioh to leave your opponent with 0 cards and without a draw phase. This is one of the most iconic cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, as its printing forced Konami to change the limited list to the forbidden and limited list. This is why it's such a shame that it got an errata that made it an entirely different card than it once was. The new version of Chaos Emperor Dragon has the same effect as the original one, but you cannot activate any other card effect the turn you use it. This checks for activating cards before as well as after Chaos Emperor Dragon comes down, meaning that if you want to use this, it must be the only thing you're doing on your turn. Functional erratas like this have always been a point of contention throughout the community, as what's the point of changing a card to unban it if it's effectively not the same card anymore? Players generally enjoy it when old powerhouses are brought back in a somewhat playable capacity. This has happened multiple times with things like Sangan seen play as recently as last year, or Ring of Destruction being playable in burn strategies. Chaos Emperor Dragon definitely won't ever be able to come back into the game with its old effect, but when it comes to dealing with such an iconic card, it'd be better to either print a new card that attempts to bounce its old effect, such as a Pot of Greed or a Pot of Desires, or to just accept it's going to be a permanent fixture on the list, like Graceful Charity. The new CED printing only serves to waste the cardboard it's been printed on. And at number 6, we have Night Assailant. This is a level 3 Dark Fiend flip monster with meager stats that has the effect to pop a monster your opponent controls when it's flip face up. Additionally, if it's sent from the hand to the graveyard, it lets you target another flip monster in your graveyard and add it to your hand. And with this card's newest errata, you have to add a flip monster that is not Night Assailant instead. The subtle change in wording has to do with how its old effect would play out when you had multiple copies of this card in rotation. With its past effect, if you discarded Night Assailant for something like Raigeki Break while you had another one in the graveyard already, you'd be able to target the other one and add it back to your hand. This gave you infinite discard fodder while you had a little loop going on, thus giving Night Assailant a place in the meta back then as a man-eater bug with an extra upside. The card saw play as an advantage engine for decks which played discard traps back then, up until it got limited to 1 to prevent said loop. And it remained playable anyways as a way to recycle good flip effect monsters like Dekoichi for a few years, before being naturally phased out of the meta as flip effects became too slow. In 2022, Assailant got an errata and was then allowed to come back to 3. The issue at hand is that Assailant would have been already unplayable at 3 with its old text. This kind of advantage engine has been far too slow to do anything since forever. The only utility they'd have is a 2-card combo for infinite discard fodder, which there aren't really any good outlets for anyway. Sure, you can use Snipe Hunter to pop your opponent's whole board, or Cold Enchantress for OTKs, but those would hardly be relevant in 2015, much less now. In the end, what this errata did was slightly nerf the card in speed duels, an alternate format with a much lower power level and limited card pool who had just received it. And at number 5, we have Sinister Serpent. This is a level 1 water reptile monster which originally read that during your standby phase, if it's in your graveyard, you can add it back to your hand for free. In its errata form, this card's effect not only became a hard once per turn, but it also makes you banish a Sinister Serpent from your graveyard during your opponent's next end phase. This card used to be one of the hugest staples of old Yu-Gi-Oh! Once it got into rotation, Sinister Serpent gave you value for the rest of the game in the form of easy +1s during each of your standby phases. While it's not as impactful as a +1 as something like a Pot of Greed since you're only getting this weak monster back, it was still strong enough to be in a lot of decks. Its main application being letting you use cards which discarded for free. There were lots of great forms of removal locked behind discard costs back then, such as Raigeki Break and Phoenix Wing Windblast, and also cards that comboed well with the extra fodder, such as Graceful Charity and Mirage of Nightmare. This kind of resource generation from the graveyard was something that wouldn't be seen in any other card all the way until Treeborn Frog, and that's why this card got banned alongside a lot of other staples in 2005. Around 10 years later, this card would get an errata before being brought back into the game, and to no one's surprise, it never saw play again. 2015 was the time where the game started speeding up massively, where we got combo behemoths like Pepe. Even outside of that, control decks now had access to much better resource loops within their own engines, like Seer and Dante. This card not only had no niche, it was also massively nerfed, and just like most other entries in this list, it saw no play after being changed. And at number 4, we have Mermail Abystus. This is a level 7 water aqua monster with the effect to special summon itself from your hand at the cost of discarding one other water monster to the graveyard. If it's summoned this way, you add a level 4 lower Mermail monster from your deck to your hand. Abystus has always been the best high-level monster from the archetype. It has the easiest summon condition out of all of them, requiring just a single discard. It's important to note that this kind of cost is a huge boon for its deck though, since the Atlanteans all have amazing effects when pitched for the cost of a water monster's effect, with heavy infantry and marksmen giving you removal and dragoons giving you a search. When brought out, it also searches for the deck's other best normal summons in Mermail Abyssspike. It did so much for the deck it even came out already limited when it got imported into the OCG, where they wouldn't free it until years after Mermail's dominance on the meta was up. This card would end up receiving an errata while Mermails weren't doing much of anything in 2017. It just changed how the effect to search when summoned worked. Before it read you can add, making it optional, and now it's obligatory. This was a very unusual change which was quietly rolled out without much fanfare. In practice, what it did was that it made it so that you wouldn't be able to chain block Tiz's effect. In Yu-Gi-Oh, you first build a chain for obligatory effects and then for the optional ones. And since the Atlanteans are all obligatory, this meant you could choose the order of the chain to protect Abystis. This change essentially made it so that whenever you pitched an Atlantean for this card, the Atlantean's effect would be Chainlink 1, and Abystis on Summon's effect would need to be Chainlink 2. This wouldn't have been nearly as relevant back when it first came out, but in the more modern game, that meant you couldn't build the chain to protect Abystis from hand traps such as Ghost Ogre and Ash Blossom, making this errata into a nerf, even if it wasn't a big one. People were initially confused by this change, as the deck hadn't done anything despite having received legacy support not long before, and many wondered if it was a preventative measure for some more future support, though that never came to be. And at number 3, we have Armory Arm. This is a level 4 light machine synchro with generic materials, which works like a union monster. In that once per turn, you can equip this card to another monster or special summon from the spell and trap card zone in attack position. While it's equipped by this effect, the monster gains 1000 attack. And if it destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you inflict damage to your opponent equal to the destroyed monster's attack. Armory Arm was one of the best generic synchros around back when it was still the newest summoning mechanic. This was in part due to being the only level 4 synchro at the time, but it was also amazing at enabling OTKs. The extra damage could often be the difference between ending the game or not, but there was also a very popular OTK build around this card. By summoning both Colossal Fighter and Armory Arm in the same turn, you can use Armory Arm to equip itself to an opponent's monster with more than 1800 attack, and then crash Colossal into it. Since Armory Arm doesn't specify you have to be the one beating over an opponent's monster, it'll burn your opponent for 2800 when you crash into it, and then Colossal can special summon itself back from the graveyard since it's just been destroyed by battle, allowing you to crash it again. Repeat this a couple more times and you can deplete your opponent's life points with just these 2 cards. This interaction was used as a payoff for many synchro combo decks for that time, such as Fish OTK, and though it wasn't something every deck could do, it was definitely a strategy you needed to be prepared for. That is, until Konami errated Armory Arm a couple years after its initial release, making it so that its effect would now check the destroyed monster's attack in the graveyard, making it not work with Colossal since it comes back and breaking up the OTK entirely. This errata was probably done as a way to unify how the card worked between the TCG and the OCG, since in Japan the card had slightly different wording, and so it was ruled there that the OTK wouldn't actually work. Still, the weird part about this errata is that when 2022 came around and an Armory Arm got a reprint in the West, it had gotten its original effect back, making the OTK possible yet again. This is possibly the only instance of an errata being reverted, and stealthily at that. As it's not like there was any announcement about it, Konami simply updated the database with its newer tax and called it a day. And at number 2, we have Gyroid Guardian. This is a level 6 synchro monster, which takes an Earth Tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters and has 2800 attack. Whenever it destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can special summon that monster to your side of the field in defense position. Gyroid was one of, if not the most powerful synchro back when the mechanic was still fresh out of the oven. With a gargantuan attack stat of 2800, eclipsed not only all other synchros of its level, it also beat many of the higher level ones as well. Not only is this a huge threat, it also snowballed extremely quickly, as it still in effect turns every successful battle from a +1 into a +2. It's important to note that before its errata, this card had no restriction on its summoning materials, and also that level 6 synchros were really easily accessible. This card, together with Brionic, gave you tools to deal with almost everything that could be thrown at you. It made decks with easier access to level 6 synchros like Black Wings a considerable force within the metagame. Similarly to Brio, this card spent a long time limited before being banned due to how much they invalidated the rest of the available synchro pool. The thing is that Brio proved to be much stronger than Gyroid in the long run. Battle-related effects fell off extremely quickly, while Brio's ability to bounce cards only got more applications with time. This led to Gyroid eventually being freed somewhat around 2014, and though it still saw some play in decks like Shaddolls, it wasn't really that big of a deal anymore. That is, according to the eyes of the TCG. In the OCG, this card remained banned all the way until 2017, where they finally allowed it to come back, but only with its errata to its materials, which made it require an Earth Tuner. To the eyes of the West, this was completely unnecessary, as the card had fallen out naturally a long time ago. To put things into perspective, the TCG got this change a month after Zodiac Trident was released, the power level disparity between these two cards being such that Trident is still banned to this day. It isn't clear if the OCG really feared this card, or if they just held a grudge from back when it dominated the metagame. But this is definitely one of the most unwarranted nerfs to a monster out there. And finally, at number 1, we have Imperial Order. This is a continuous trap card, which reads, pre-errata, negate all spell effects on the field. During your standby phase, pay 700 life points or destroy this card. Imperial Order got banned really early on in Yu-Gi-Oh's lifespan, finding itself a place on the Forbidden List all the way back in 2004, for a really obvious reason too. This card allowed you to lock your opponent out of spells entirely for a few turns, which has always been game-winning, and when you wanted to use your spells yourself, you could just choose to not pay the maintenance costs and it would destroy itself. It took over 10 years, but eventually Konami thought this card would be fine to be brought back into the game with one small change. They changed it so the 700 life point payment was no longer optional and also was done during both players' turns, meaning you couldn't get rid of your own IO as easily as before. While this did lower the power of the card slightly, it was still one of the most powerful floodgates in the history of the game. Overnight, this card became a staple in pretty much every side deck as one of the best going first options you could have. Spell cards play a vital role in pretty much every single deck, often being consistency pieces, utility, and removal. If you go first and have IO, you can use all your spells that you desire on your turn, and then when your opponent tries to use them to deal with your board, you flip over IO and lock them out of the game. Locking yourself out of spells for the next turn doesn't matter if you're so far ahead that your opponent can't possibly come back into the fray. It didn't help that many decks could easily deal with their IO if they still needed to use spells, like Exodia and Dryden to pop their own. This one of and many side decks helped turn many Yu-Gi-Oh matches into non-games by how much it restricted your opponent going second, filling a similar role to what Trap Dust Shoe did in the past. This card only got more toxic as time passed too. The game became faster, making this even more of a blowout than it already was. The release of Pot of Prosperity gave decks even a higher chance of fighting it when going first, since many players would do their whole combo to empty the deck of their engine pieces, and then have an even higher chance of finding their order. Worst of all is that in the presence of Mystic Mine in the format, the card even had a reasonable reason to be main decked as it was a pretty good out, which made it more than a post-side worry. Now, despite being so hated and seeing such consistent play, Konami seemed unwilling to hit it all the way until early 2022, as if they couldn't admit they had made a mistake. Of all the erratas around, the one to Imperial Order is the most unfortunate one, not because it ruined the card, but because of all the formats it made worse with its existence.